My name is Lawrence. I am 70 years old and currently navigating the darkest chapter of my existence. After my beautiful wife passed away, my greedy daughter-in-law smiled coldly by her fresh grave and demanded I hand over my entire company to her infant son. She told me I would be left to fend for myself or die completely alone. I simply smiled back at her. What she did not know was that my ruthless corporate lawyer was already on his way carrying a DNA test that would absolutely destroy her perfect fake life. Before I continue this story, let me know exactly where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who severely underestimated your worth and your intelligence. The biting autumn wind swept violently across the quiet cemetery, carrying the heavy scent of damp earth and fresh lilies. I stood perfectly still, watching the tired cemetery workers begin to lower the heavy mahogany casket into the deep ground. Gwendolyn, my wife of 45 years, was permanently gone. The brilliant woman who had been my steady compass and my ultimate strength was returning to the cold earth. I desperately wanted a moment of absolute silence to say my final goodbye to her. I wanted to close my heavy eyes and remember her warm, comforting laughter filling our home. But true predators do not respect human grief. Before the last tearful mourner had even walked toward the distant parking lot, I heard the sharp, arrogant crunch of expensive designer heels on the gravel directly behind me. It was Meredith, my daughter-in-law. She did not offer a comforting hand or a soft tissue to dry my tears. She simply crossed her arms tightly across her pristine black coat and stepped aggressively into my line of sight. "Lawrence, we need to talk right now," she said, her voice sharp and entirely devoid of any human warmth. "The guests are leaving, and we have absolutely no time to waste on pointless sentiments. We need to legally secure the assets of Iron Root Logistics before the end of the business day." I looked at her pale, demanding face in utter disbelief. My beloved wife was not even fully buried yet, and this ruthless woman was already staking her claim on our life's grueling work. I studied Meredith with a quiet, analytical calmness. She possessed the specific kind of dangerous arrogance that only comes from someone who has never had to build anything from nothing. She looked at our massive logistics company as a magical bank account that owed her a luxurious lifestyle forever. She had absolutely no idea what it truly took to create it. My weary mind drifted briefly back to the sweltering, brutal summer of 1982. Gwendolyn and I were sitting at our scratched wooden kitchen table looking at a terrifying mountain of past due bills. We made the dangerous decision to take out a massive second mortgage on our tiny starter home just to buy our very first commercial 18-wheeler truck. We drove that massive machine ourselves, taking turns sleeping in the cramped cab, eating cold sandwiches, and bathing in cheap, lonely truck stops. We built our national empire with blistered hands and countless sleepless nights fighting fiercely against a corrupt system that constantly tried to push a black-owned trucking company out of the competitive market. Gwendolyn managed the financial books with ruthless precision, while I expanded the vehicle fleet across state lines. Meredith saw none of that painful history. She only saw the millions in the bank. Standing 2 feet behind her was my biological son, Darren. He was 35 years old, but he looked exactly like a frightened child hiding behind his mother's skirt. He stared blankly at the green grass, completely refusing to make any eye contact with me. He allowed his cruel wife to disrespect his grieving father right over his mother's fresh grave. The heavy silence between us stretched out, becoming toxic and deeply painful. "You are not listening to me, Lawrence," Meredith snapped loudly, taking another aggressive step forward to invade my personal space. Her pale blue eyes were wide with a frightening predatory intensity. "The company needs strong, youthful leadership immediately. You are 70 years old and clearly too emotional to handle the massive corporate accounts right now. I have already drafted the official transfer deeds. You are going to sign Iron Root Logistics over to my infant son's trust fund, which Darren and I will exclusively manage. You will step down permanently and fend for yourself." I stared at her, letting the sheer blinding audacity of her demand hang in the freezing cemetery air. She seriously wanted me to surrender 40 years of blood and sweat into her greedy hands and walk away with absolutely nothing. When I did not immediately answer, her tone shifted from demanding to purely vicious. "Do not test me, old man," she hissed, leaning in so close that only Darren and I could hear her venomous words. "You have no one left to protect you. If you do not sign those legal papers tonight, I will pack up my son and leave this state forever. I will ensure you never see your only grandson again. I will freeze you out of Darren's life completely. You will die alone in that big empty house with absolutely nothing to show for your pathetic existence. Choose right now. It is the logistics company or your family." She felt incredibly powerful in that dark moment. She was actively using an innocent child as a weapon to extort a grieving widower. She truly believed I was a broken old man who would easily trade his entire hard-earned fortune just to avoid the deep pain of total isolation. She deeply misunderstood exactly who she was dealing with. A weak man would have screamed at her in a fit of uncontrollable rage. A foolish man would have caused a massive scene right in front of the remaining funeral guests and cemetery staff. But Gwendolyn had taught me a long time ago that the loudest person in the room is always the weakest. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I simply buttoned my dark suit jacket, looked down at the fresh dirt covering my wife's beautiful casket, and then looked directly into Meredith's triumphant waiting eyes. I nodded my head with absolute icy precision. "You make a very compelling argument, Meredith," I said smoothly, keeping my deep voice completely devoid of any emotion or fear. "Business is business after all. Bring your legal documents to my home office tonight at exactly 8:00 for a formal reading of the estate. We will settle the transfer of these assets exactly as you wish." Her face instantly lit up with greedy satisfaction. She grabbed Darren aggressively by the arm and pulled him away toward their waiting luxury sedan without offering a single word of farewell or comfort. They quickly drove away, leaving me standing totally alone among the silent tombstones. I reached into my heavy coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I dialed the private unlisted number of Jonathan, my fiercely loyal corporate attorney. He answered promptly on the very first ring. "Jonathan," I said quietly, watching the red taillights of my son's expensive car disappear down the winding cemetery road. "The trap has been set exactly as Gwendolyn predicted it would be. Cancel your evening plans and come to my house at 8:00 sharp. And Jonathan, make sure you bring the envelope." The brutal game had officially begun, and they had absolutely no idea they were already walking straight into a slaughterhouse. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck exactly 8 times when the heavy oak doors of my private home office swung open. Meredith did not bother to knock. She marched in wearing a sharp gray business suit, carrying a thick leather binder tucked firmly under her arm. Darren trailed quietly behind her, gently closing the door before immediately retreating to the darkest corner of the room. I remained seated in my high-backed leather chair, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the polished mahogany. I said absolutely nothing, letting the silence stretch until it became thick and suffocating. Meredith hated silence. It forced her to confront her own nervous energy. She slapped her binder onto the center of my desk with a sharp thud. She leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the wood, attempting to tower over me. Her pale eyes were completely devoid of any sympathy or respect. She had prepared a specific speech, and she delivered it with the cold efficiency of a corporate raider executing a hostile takeover. "Let us skip the pleasantries, Lawrence," she said, her voice dripping with pure venom. "Now that the old woman is gone, you will put the company in my son's name and fend for yourself." I slowly reached out and picked up my crystal glass of aged bourbon. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the amber liquid burn pleasantly down my throat. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show a single ounce of the intense fury boiling inside my chest. I simply looked at her, observing the frantic pulse of a woman desperate for unearned power. My mind drifted back to a quiet evening exactly 2 years ago. Gwendolyn and I were sitting on our back porch watching the sunset. Darren had just brought his newborn son over for a brief visit. I remembered Gwendolyn staring at the sleeping infant with her sharp, calculating eyes. She had built our logistics empire by spotting tiny discrepancies in massive financial ledgers, and she applied that same ruthless precision to people. "Lawrence," she had whispered, making absolutely sure Darren was out of earshot, "that child has completely straight hair, pale eyes, and a bone structure that does not match a single generation of our African-American family lineage. Meredith is hiding something massive, and my grandson is merely a pawn in her long game." Gwendolyn possessed a terrifying intuition. She quietly hired a premium private investigator the very next morning, refusing to let her family's legacy be stolen by a potential fraud. Now sitting across from Meredith, I realized just how perfectly right my brilliant wife had been. Meredith was leaning heavily on the existence of that child as her ultimate leverage. She genuinely believed her son was her golden ticket to the Iron Root Logistics fortune. I took another sip of my bourbon, savoring the absolute certainty that Gwendolyn had already secured my victory from beyond the grave. Irritated by my absolute calm, Meredith aggressively ripped open her leather binder. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and shoved them violently across the polished desk. The bold heading at the top read, "Irrevocable Transfer of Corporate Assets." She handed me a heavy gold pen, tapping her manicured fingernail directly on the signature line. "Sign it right now, Lawrence," she commanded, her voice echoing sharply against the wood-paneled walls. "We are transferring 100% of your voting shares into a blind trust controlled entirely by Darren and myself. You will surrender all executive authority over the vehicle fleets, the warehouses, and the corporate bank accounts immediately." I looked down at the forged documents, then shifted my gaze to Darren. My biological son was staring intently at the floorboards, refusing to intervene as his wife attempted to strip his grieving father of everything he owned. He was utterly useless. When I did not immediately pick up the pen, Meredith's fake professional demeanor completely shattered. She pulled out her cell phone and slammed it down next to the documents. "Do not force my hand," she threatened, stepping closer to my chair. "If you refuse to sign these papers tonight, I will dial Adult Protective Services immediately. I will tell them that the sudden death of your wife has caused a severe psychotic break. Darren will legally testify that you have become violent, erratic, and a profound danger to yourself. We will have you placed on a mandatory psychiatric hold by morning. By the time a judge releases you from a mental ward, we will have already secured temporary conservatorship over your estate. You will lose the company and you will spend the rest of your miserable life locked in a sterile room eating pureed food." She smiled a wicked, triumphant smile, fully believing she held all the cards. I did not even look at her phone. I remained perfectly still, listening to the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock. The silence stretched until a heavy set of footsteps echoed loudly in the hallway. The brass doorknob turned, and the heavy oak door swung wide open. Jonathan, my lead corporate attorney, walked straight into the room without bothering to knock. He wore a sharp black suit, his expression as cold and unforgiving as a block of ice. Meredith spun around, her face twisting in sudden outrage at the unexpected intrusion. "Excuse me," she snapped, stepping directly into Jonathan's path. "This is a strictly private family meeting. You need to wait outside until we are finished." Jonathan did not even acknowledge her existence. He completely ignored her, stepping around her frozen frame as if she were nothing more than a piece of cheap furniture. He walked purposefully to the center of my desk and set down his heavy leather briefcase. The metallic snap of the latches echoed sharply in the tense room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick sealed envelope bearing the official crest of the most prestigious genetic testing laboratory in the state. Without uttering a single word, Jonathan slid the certified medical document smoothly across the mahogany desk, stopping it exactly on top of Meredith's fraudulent transfer deed. I looked up at Meredith, watching the color completely drain from her arrogant face as her eyes locked onto the medical seal. The trap had just snapped shut. Jonathan did not wait for Meredith to comprehend the gravity of the situation. He reached down with a steady hand, broke the thick red wax seal on the envelope, and extracted the crisp white medical report. He adjusted his glasses and began to read the document out loud, his voice ringing through my private office with the clinical detachment of an executioner reading a final sentence. He clearly stated the dates of the DNA collection, the legal chain of custody, and the certified names involved in the genetic profile. Then came the devastating conclusion. The probability of Darren being the biological father of Meredith's child is 0%. The genetic markers show absolutely no biological relationship between the two subjects. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniably final. In a matter of mere seconds, the foundational pillar of Meredith's entire hostile takeover strategy was completely vaporized into thin air. She had heavily relied on the existence of a biological grandson to guilt me into surrendering the massive generational wealth my wife and I had bled to build. She genuinely thought she possessed the ultimate leverage, the golden key to the Iron Root Logistics treasury. Without a legitimate bloodline connecting her child to our family trust, she possessed absolutely zero legal standing to challenge the estate. Jonathan placed the paper back on the desk, smoothing out the edges with meticulous care. He looked directly at her, his face a mask of professional indifference, watching her entire world crumble into dust before his eyes. Meredith turned an absolute sickening shade of pale. Her arrogant posture completely collapsed, replaced by the frantic, terrified body language of a cornered animal realizing the trap had just slammed shut. Her eyes darted wildly around the room as her brain struggled to calculate a new angle of attack. Unable to formulate a cohesive lie to defend herself, she lunged aggressively across the mahogany desk, her manicured fingers clawing desperately at the medical report. She wanted to rip the physical evidence to shreds and somehow destroy the truth. I anticipated her erratic movement. With a slow and highly calculated sweep of my hand, I calmly slid the document out of her reach, pulling it safely toward my chest. I folded my hands together and rested them on the wood, staring at her with icy composure. I remembered a crucial lesson Gwendolyn had taught me during a brutal union negotiation in 1989. When your opponent makes a fatal error, you do not interrupt them. You simply sit back and let the crushing weight of their own failure suffocate them in real time. I shifted my gaze away from the panicking woman and looked directly into the dark corner of the room where my son stood. I braced myself for Darren's inevitable emotional collapse. I expected to see a broken man. I expected tears of profound betrayal, the agonizing realization that his wife had used him to breed a child that was not even his own. I waited for the devastation to wash over him, fully prepared to offer him my fierce protection and help him navigate the impending divorce. I waited patiently for my son to finally wake up and see the monster standing beside my desk. The massive twist hit me harder than a physical blow ever could. Darren did not cry. He did not fall to his knees in agony or stare at his deceptive wife in horror. Instead, his face twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He stepped out of the shadows, marching toward my desk with heavy, stomping steps. He slammed both of his fists violently onto the polished wood, rattling my crystal bourbon glass and sending a shockwave through the quiet room. I already knew he screamed, his voice cracking with a pathetic, desperate energy that filled me with absolute disgust. I have known the truth for 6 months, and I do not care. The shocking admission echoed through the office, completely chilling my blood. My own flesh and blood had willingly accepted a life of profound humiliation just to keep a woman who openly despised him. He pointed an aggressive finger inches from my face. That child is my son, because I say he is, and Meredith is my wife. We are a family, and we deserve the luxurious lifestyle we were promised. You and Mom hoarded your wealth for decades while forcing me to work my way up the corporate ladder like a common employee. Meredith expects a certain high standard of living, and I will not lose her just because you want to be a stubborn old man guarding a pile of money. Hand over the logistics company right now. The sheer absurdity of his demand left a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. He was entirely willing to sacrifice his parents' hard-earned legacy, his own dignity, and his father's financial security just to appease a toxic woman who had brazenly cheated on him. He was actively using his own willful ignorance as a weapon, demanding that I finance the very betrayal that was destroying our family name. He breathed heavily, glaring at me with a sickening sense of entitlement, fully expecting me to cave to his childish temper tantrum. In that exact moment, a profound and terrible clarity washed over me. I looked at the 35-year-old man standing furiously before me, and I realized with absolute certainty that my biological son was completely corrupted beyond repair. The boy I had raised, the child Gwendolyn and I had fiercely loved and nurtured, was dead. He had been entirely consumed by his own weakness and his wife's endless greed. There was nothing left to salvage, no fatherly advice that could pull him back from the edge of his own chosen destruction. I placed my hands firmly on the armrests of my leather chair and stood up. I rose slowly, drawing myself up to my full height, towering over Darren and forcing him to take a hesitant step backward. I am not a stubborn old man hoarding money, I stated, my deep voice echoing with absolute, unwavering authority. I am the sole founder and primary shareholder of Iron Route Logistics, a company built on integrity, hard work, and fierce loyalty. You possess absolutely none of those qualities. I looked from Darren to Meredith, drawing an absolute and permanent boundary between us. You have chosen a life of pathetic subservience to a woman who views you as nothing more than a convenient bank account, I told my son. But I refuse to fund your delusions for another second. As of this exact moment, you are officially terminated from your position as Vice President of Operations. Your corporate access is entirely revoked. Your executive salary is suspended indefinitely. You will both leave my property immediately, or Jonathan will have you physically escorted out by law enforcement for trespassing. I sat back down in my chair, turning my attention completely away from them and picking up my glass of bourbon, dismissing their entire existence with a single devastating motion. Darren grabbed Meredith by the elbow and practically dragged her out of my office. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them with a violent thud rattling the framed photographs on the wall. I did not move from my leather chair. I simply finished my bourbon and listened to the screeching tires of their luxury sedan speeding away from my property. Jonathan packed his briefcase in absolute silence, giving me a solemn nod before departing into the night. 3 hours later, the illusion of my victory was abruptly shattered by the cold reality of digital warfare. I sat in front of my glowing computer monitor, attempting to authorize the midnight payroll for our long-haul truck drivers. A glaring red error message flashed across the screen. Access denied. Account frozen. I typed in my master administrative overrides, but the system completely rejected my credentials. Darren had not driven straight home to lick his wounds. Driven by Meredith's frantic coaching, he had immediately logged into the company's internal mainframe. Using the highest level of his vice president security clearance before the Human Resources Department could officially process his termination. In the morning, my son had maliciously executed a total freeze on Iron Route Logistics' primary operational bank accounts. He had effectively locked me out of the very empire I built, severing the financial arteries that kept thousands of trucks moving across the country. I stared at the flashing red error message illuminating my dark office. A lesser man would have panicked, imagining the catastrophic chain reaction of unpaid drivers, delayed shipments, and massive contractual penalties. But I simply leaned back in my chair and allowed a slow, knowing smile to cross my face. Darren deeply misunderstood the foundational architecture of the company he was trying to steal. He only understood the modern digital interfaces, the shiny corporate dashboards, and the convenient online banking portals. He completely lacked the gritty institutional knowledge of how this empire was truly constructed. My beautiful Gwendolyn was a master accountant who survived the turbulent financial crashes of the 1980s and 90s. She fiercely distrusted purely digital systems, always anticipating a day when technology or human betrayal might fail us. She had meticulously built ironclad physical redundancies into our banking architecture. Deep within the foundational bylaws of Iron Route Logistics, Gwendolyn had established a secondary tier of shadow accounts completely disconnected from the primary digital network. These ghost accounts required physical signatures ink on paper and face-to-face verification with the senior banking executives we had known for decades. Darren could lock the digital doors all he wanted. He had no idea that Gwendolyn had handed me the master skeleton keys 30 years ago. I reached into my bottom desk drawer and pulled out a heavy leather-bound ledger, running my fingers over Gwendolyn's perfect handwriting. I began carefully dialing the private home numbers of the men who actually controlled the flow of money in this state. As I waited for the regional bank president to answer my late-night call, my cell phone vibrated sharply against the mahogany desk. The screen lit up, displaying a new text message from Darren's number. However, the vicious, gloating tone of the words instantly revealed the true author. It was Meredith. She could not resist the overwhelming urge to brag about her temporary digital victory. The message was a masterclass in arrogant delusion. "I told you not to test me, Lawrence," the text read. "Darren is the future of this company, and I am the future of Darren. We have officially seized control of the primary capital. You are completely locked out. By tomorrow morning, the board will recognize your severe mental decline and appoint my husband as the permanent chief executive officer. If you want to keep your house and pay your utility bills, you will have to politely request a weekly allowance from me. Submit to the new reality or starve." She actually believed she had cornered a hungry wolf in a digital cage. She thought freezing a few commercial accounts was the ultimate checkmate. Meredith failed to comprehend that she was playing a childish game of checkers while I was orchestrating a ruthless campaign of total financial annihilation. Her text message was not a threat. It was a legally documented written confession of unauthorized corporate sabotage. She had effectively provided me with the exact ammunition I needed to absolutely destroy their financial credibility. I took a clear screenshot of the mocking text message and forwarded it directly to Jonathan. He would need it for the aggressive fraud litigation we were about to unleash. My phone vibrated a second time. It was a notification from the company's automated expense tracking system. Despite freezing the operational accounts to cripple the business, Darren was actively using his corporate platinum credit card. The system pinged a massive, pending transaction at an exclusive 24-hour luxury boutique downtown. He was actually out buying a $30,000 designer watch to celebrate his supposed hostile takeover. I did not waste a single second arguing with Meredith over text messages. I did not dignity her arrogant threats with a response. Instead, I picked up my heavy brass landline and dialed the direct personal extension of Thomas Blackwood, the primary commercial bank president who had financed my very first fleet of trucks. Thomas answered with the groggy confusion of a man woken up in the middle of the night, but his tone instantly sharpened the moment he heard my voice. I did not offer any pleasantries. "Thomas," I said with absolute icy authority, "my son has gone completely rogue. He has initiated an unauthorized digital freeze on the primary logistics accounts. I need you to manually override the digital lockout using the Gwendolyn protocols we established in 1995. Thomas did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Consider it done, Lawrence," he replied, the sound of him urgently typing on his secure terminal echoing through the receiver. I had one final instruction for my old friend. "Furthermore, Thomas, I need you to unilaterally revoke and permanently cancel Darren's corporate platinum credit cards. Do it right this exact second." I hung up the phone and stared at the glowing expense tracker on my computer monitor. I pictured Darren standing inside that brightly lit luxury boutique, smugly sliding his heavy metal corporate card across the glass counter, fully expecting to walk out with a diamond-encrusted trophy. I watched the green pending transaction on my screen suddenly turn bright red. The word "declined" flashed violently across the dashboard. The trap had sprung, leaving him publicly humiliated and financially castrated in front of the city's most elite jewelers. The humiliation at the luxury boutique was absolute and incredibly swift. Darren was escorted out by armed security guards when he aggressively tried to argue with the store manager over his suddenly declined platinum card. He retreated to his vehicle in total disgrace, immediately calling Meredith in a state of absolute panic. But Meredith did not cower or surrender. Instead of accepting her defeat, she doubled down with a vicious counterattack. By 6 o'clock the next morning, my personal cell phone began ringing relentlessly. I let the first few calls go to voicemail, focusing on my morning coffee until the urgent caller ID of my lead dispatcher flashed across the screen. Meredith had weaponized her early morning hours. She personally contacted the regional directors of Iron Root's top 3 fuel vendors. Using her polished corporate tone, she fed them a highly rehearsed lie. She claimed I had suffered a catastrophic stroke in the middle of the night, leaving me with severe, irreversible dementia. She informed them that a bitter legal battle over conservatorship had just frozen all corporate assets. Panicked by the massive financial liability of unpaid fuel invoices, the vendors reacted exactly as Meredith had calculated. They initiated an immediate emergency freeze on all active fuel lines associated with our company fleet. The devastating consequences hit the interstate highways almost immediately. My phone became an endless barrage of frantic reports from panicked truck drivers stranded at massive truck stops from Texas to Ohio. Hundreds of fully loaded 18-wheelers were completely immobilized, their fuel cards flashing error codes at the diesel pumps. Millions of dollars in perishable freight were suddenly ticking toward expiration under the brutal morning sun. The dispatchers were begging for authorization codes I could not digitally provide. I closed my eyes and listened to the desperate crackle of the two-way radio feed echoing from my computer speakers. I did not panic. I felt a profound sense of familiarity. 40 years ago, I drove those exact same grueling routes. I knew the unforgiving stretch of asphalt connecting the Midwest depots, and I knew the deep burning frustration of being stranded at a diesel pump with a cold engine and zero cash. More importantly, I knew the men and women gripping those steering wheels. I had not built my empire exclusively from a mahogany desk. I built it on the pavement, breaking bread with the very same union bosses who now commanded my workforce. Gwendolyn and I had personally paid for the hospital bills of our first drivers when the union strikes of the late 80s threatened to break them. We bled together. Meredith treated these drivers like disposable numbers on a spreadsheet, vastly underestimating the deep, unbreakable loyalty forged in the trenches of blue-collar labor. I grabbed my keys, threw my heavy coat over my shoulders, and headed straight for my vehicle. I drove my dark sedan straight to the primary regional depot on the outskirts of the city. The massive staging yard was an absolute scene of escalating chaos. Dozens of massive rigs were parked haphazardly, their engines dead, while angry drivers gathered in loud, frustrated clusters near the main dispatch building. As I parked my vehicle and stepped out onto the oil-stained concrete, the cold morning wind carried the unmistakable, entitled voice of my son through a handheld megaphone. Darren was standing on the elevated loading dock, frantically pacing back and forth, attempting to incite a full-blown labor strike against his own father. He was surrounded by a few of the newer younger drivers who did not know our rich history. "Listen to me," Darren shouted, his voice cracking with desperate, nervous energy. "My father has completely lost his mind. He is hoarding the operational funds and refusing to pay the vendor accounts. He does not care if you sit here and freeze. He does not care if your families go hungry this week. If you stand with me right now and refuse to move these trucks, we can force the board to remove him. I will personally guarantee a 10% pay raise for every man who signs my petition for a rapid change in leadership." I walked slowly through the thick crowd of heavy jackets and steel-toed boots. The veteran drivers immediately recognized me. The loud, angry chatter systematically died down as I moved forward, parting the sea of frustrated men. Darren spotted me approaching, and the megaphone visibly shook in his trembling hands. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to project a hollow authority he had never actually earned. He genuinely believed that a crowd of angry laborers would physically turn on me for freezing their fuel cards. I did not utter a single word to my treacherous son. I walked directly to the front of the crowd and placed my heavy leather briefcase flat onto the cold metal hood of a nearby transport truck. Marcus, the grizzled, broad-shouldered president of the local drivers' union, stepped forward with a deep scowl etched into his weathered face. He crossed his massive arms, waiting for an explanation. I snapped open the brass locks of the briefcase and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized financial ledger. I did not show it to the crowd. I handed it directly to Marcus. "I asked my forensic accountant to dig into Darren's secondary accounts last night," I said calmly, projecting my voice so every man in the yard could hear the undeniable truth. "Look at the highlighted transactions from the past 14 months. Marcus scanned the pages, his dark eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "My son has been intentionally routing our secondary fuel contracts to a severely overpriced vendor in the neighboring county," I continued, pointing a firm finger at the terrified man standing on the loading dock. "In exchange for overcharging this company, Darren has been pocketing a substantial illegal cash kickback on every single gallon of diesel you pumped. He stole directly from our profit-sharing margins to fund his wife's luxury lifestyle." Marcus slammed the ledger shut with a violently loud crack. He glared up at Darren with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The sudden shift in the crowd was terrifyingly swift. The younger drivers who had just been cheering for Darren immediately turned their backs on him, stepping away from the loading dock in utter contempt. Darren dropped the megaphone, his face draining of all color, as the entire workforce of Iron Route Logistics silently realized he was nothing more than a wealthy, pathetic thief. Darren stumbled backward on the loading dock, his eyes darting frantically across the sea of disgusted faces. He did not try to defend himself. He simply turned and practically ran toward his expensive sedan, peeling out of the depot parking lot in absolute disgrace. I spent the rest of the afternoon manually overriding the vendor locks over the phone with my banking contacts, getting my drivers back on the road where they belonged. By the time I returned to my quiet suburban home, the sun had fully set, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawn. I poured myself a single glass of bourbon and sat in my armchair waiting for the inevitable retaliation. Meredith was a cornered animal, and cornered animals always lash out with wild, unpredictable violence. I did not have to wait very long. The blinding flash of red and blue emergency lights suddenly illuminated my living room, painting the walls with a frantic, pulsing rhythm. 3 heavy police cruisers aggressively pulled into my long, circular driveway, their tires crunching loudly against the gravel. The heavy thud of car doors slamming shut echoed through the crisp evening air. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink. I placed the crystal glass precisely on a cork coaster, stood up, and walked calmly to the front door. I opened the heavy oak door before the officers could even ring the bell. 2 large uniformed policemen stood on my porch, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. Standing safely behind their broad shoulders, half swallowed by the darkness of the driveway, was my son Darren. He looked down at the pavement, playing the role of the traumatized witness perfectly. Mr. Lawrence, the lead officer, said, his voice carrying the heavy authoritative weight of the law. "We are here investigating a serious domestic violence complaint. Your daughter-in-law, Meredith, is currently at the local hospital being treated for a severe concussion and heavy bruising. She filed an official police report stating that you physically attacked her in your home office last night, throwing her violently against the wall when she tried to discuss corporate matters." Darren stepped out from the shadows, nodding his head with a pathetic display of fake grief. "I saw him do it, officers," Darren lied, his voice trembling with rehearsed fear. "My father lost his mind. He hit her with a heavy book and shoved her. I tried to stop him, but he is out of control. I looked at the boy I had raised, feeling a profound wave of icy disgust. He was actively attempting to send his 70-year-old father to a violent state prison just to steal a logistics company. My mind flashed back to the day Gwendolyn insisted we install military-grade security across the entire estate. She always said that wealth attracts vultures, but the most dangerous predators are the ones who already have a key to your front door. She knew Meredith was capable of physical theatrics to play the ultimate victim. The lead officer unclipped the heavy metal handcuffs from his duty belt. The sharp clinking sound of the steel rings cut clearly through the cool night air. "Sir, given the severity of the victim's injuries and the direct eyewitness testimony from your own son, I need you to step out onto the porch and place your hands behind your back. You are being placed under arrest for aggravated assault." Darren practically vibrated with eager anticipation. He desperately wanted to see me humiliated, stripped of my dignity, and shoved into the back of a police cruiser like a common criminal. He believed this dramatic public execution of my character would finally secure his absolute control over Iron Route Logistics. A lesser man would have panicked. A foolish man would have raised his voice aggressively, protesting his innocence and arguing frantically with the armed officers on his front lawn. I did absolutely none of that. I maintained perfect, unflinching eye contact with the lead officer. "Officer," I said with a deep, resonant calmness that completely disarmed the escalating tension. "I am a 70-year-old man with a spotless criminal record and deep ties to this community. I have absolutely no intention of resisting or causing a scene. However, before you place those metal cuffs on my wrists and finalize an arrest that will inevitably result in a massive wrongful prosecution lawsuit against this department, I highly recommend you step inside my home for exactly 3 minutes. I have a pot of fresh coffee in the kitchen and a piece of digital evidence in my office that will completely alter the trajectory of your entire night." The officers exchanged a highly skeptical glance. The absolute certainty in my voice gave them pause. After a brief moment of silent deliberation, the lead officer nodded, gesturing for me to lead the way. Darren panicked instantly, shouting that I was trying to manipulate them, but the officers ignored him and followed me across the threshold. I led the armed officers directly into my private mahogany office, the exact room where the supposed brutal assault had taken place. Darren hovered nervously in the doorway, his confident facade rapidly dissolving into sheer terror. I walked behind my heavy desk and bypassed the standard computer monitor entirely. Instead, I opened a concealed lower cabinet revealing a highly encrypted independent security server that even my own son did not know existed. I quickly typed in the complex alphanumeric passcode Gwendolyn had generated years ago. The large digital screen on the wall instantly flickered to life, displaying crystal-clear, high-definition video footage of the office from multiple angles. I pulled up the timestamp from the previous evening's disastrous meeting. The officers leaned in closely, watching the silent, undeniable truth unfold in full color. The video clearly showed Jonathan leaving the room. It showed Meredith enraged and completely unhinged by her sudden failure, screaming wildly. Then, in a moment of pure calculated madness, the footage captured Meredith grabbing a heavy hardcover book from a nearby shelf, viciously striking herself in the forehead, and intentionally hurling her own body backward against the solid wooden doorframe. All the while, I remained seated in my leather chair, perfectly still, a full 10 feet away from her frantic self-mutilation. The lead officer let out a sharp, heavy breath, his jaw tightening as he watched the irrefutable proof of the malicious setup. The metal handcuffs dangled uselessly from his grip. The officers turned around simultaneously, their eyes locking onto Darren with a terrifying, furious intensity. Darren backed away from the doorway, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender as the officers marched toward him to address the severe felony of filing a false police report. The lead officer grabbed Darren roughly by the shoulder, shoving him toward the front door. Because I declined to press formal charges for the false police report, the officers let my son off with a severe threatening warning that promised immediate and violent jail time if he ever dialed emergency services on me again. Darren stumbled out into the cool night air, thoroughly humiliated and terrified, fleeing the property on foot without looking back. I locked the heavy oak door behind him, savoring the profound silence that finally returned to my home. But the operational freeze on the company bank accounts had still done massive structural damage. I needed immediate liquid capital to float the driver payroll and keep the union bosses completely appeased until Jonathan could legally destroy Darren's digital lockout. I walked back into my office and moved a heavy oil painting aside to reveal my secure wall safe. Inside rested the physical, original deeds to our primary commercial warehouses. They were totally unencumbered assets, the perfect collateral for a rapid multi-million-dollar bridge loan from my private banking contacts. I quickly spun the heavy brass dial, inputting the complex numerical combination Gwendolyn and I had chosen decades ago. The heavy steel door clicked loudly and swung open. I reached my hand into the dark, velvet-lined interior, fully expecting to feel the thick, familiar weight of the legal folders. My fingers met absolutely nothing but cold steel. I pulled the small interior light switch to illuminate the vault. The safe was completely empty. The warehouse deeds were gone. A cold, calculating anger washed over me as I stared into the empty vault. I did not waste time tearing the office apart in a frantic, emotional search. I knew exactly who had taken them, but I needed to know exactly how and when the theft occurred. I returned to my desk and accessed the encrypted security server once again. I bypassed the recent footage of Meredith's pathetic theatrical performance and began methodically scrubbing through the archived video files from the past 6 months. I stopped the playback on a painful, hazy afternoon from late November. The footage showed the final agonizing weeks of Gwendolyn's life when we had transformed my office into a makeshift hospice room so she could look out at her beloved garden. The silent video displayed my beautiful wife sleeping peacefully in her medical bed. Darren was sitting in the corner chair pretending to read a book. I remembered that specific day clearly. I had briefly left the room to speak with the palliative care nurses in the hallway. On the screen, the exact moment I exited, Darren stood up. He did not check on his dying mother. He walked directly to the oil painting, slid it aside, and carefully inspected the brass dial of the safe. Gwendolyn had required me to retrieve her heavy pain medication from that vault earlier that morning. Darren had been sitting silently in the room, feigning deep grief while actively memorizing the precise numerical rotation of my hands. He had used his mother's agonizing final days as a convenient distraction to steal the foundational assets of our entire logistics empire. He had waited until the chaotic distraction of the police visit tonight to finally slip those folders into his jacket. My desk phone rang sharply, shattering the quiet focus of the room. It was Jonathan. He did not bother with a polite greeting. "Lawrence, we have a massive escalating crisis," he announced, his usually calm voice laced with urgent professional tension. "I just received a rapid legal notification from the county clerk's office. Darren and Meredith have formally filed a newly discovered amendment to Gwendolyn's last will and testament. They are claiming Gwendolyn secretly signed over her entire share of the commercial warehouses to Meredith's infant trust just days before she passed." I gripped the heavy receiver tightly. "That is completely impossible," I stated firmly. "Gwendolyn and I drafted our wills together. She never amended anything." "It is a blatant forgery," Jonathan agreed instantly, "but they have executed it brilliantly. They hired a highly corrupt underground notary to officially stamp and backdate the fraudulent signatures. They used the stolen warehouse deeds to prove they hold the physical assets. And Lawrence, it gets significantly worse. They did not just file the paperwork to challenge the estate. They used those stolen deeds and the forged will as immediate hard collateral to secure a massive 8-figure cash loan." I closed my eyes, visualizing the sheer scale of the financial destruction. "No legitimate commercial bank would authorize a loan of that magnitude so quickly," I replied. "They bypassed the standard banking system entirely," Jonathan confirmed. "They went directly to a highly aggressive, notoriously shady private equity firm. This firm specializes in predatory lending and hostile corporate takeovers. They handed Darren the cash within hours, knowing that if he defaults on the payments, they can legally seize your primary warehouses and cripple Iron Route Logistics permanently." I demanded Jonathan give me the exact name and residential address of the notary who stamped the fraudulent documents. I did not wait for the morning sun to solve this escalating problem. I drove my dark sedan straight to the miserable, poorly lit apartment complex on the industrial side of town, where the corrupt notary resided. I parked in the deep shadows of the concrete parking garage and waited with absolute terrifying patience. Just after midnight, a nervous, sweating man in a cheap, wrinkled suit hurried toward his rusted vehicle, clutching a briefcase tightly to his chest. I stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path entirely. He froze, his eyes widening in pure terror as he instantly recognized my face from the corporate profiles. I did not threaten him with physical violence. I simply backed him against the cold concrete pillar and explained exactly how many decades he would spend in a federal penitentiary for assisting in the theft of multi-million-dollar commercial real estate. The coward broke instantly. He wept, swearing Meredith had paid him $10,000 in cash to backdate the stamp. He pleaded for mercy, claiming he did not know the sheer magnitude of the assets involved. "I am not interested in your pathetic excuses," I told him, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "I want the name of the private equity firm that authorized the massive bridge loan. I want the name of the man holding my stolen deeds right now." The notary shook violently, terrified of the powerful people he had just done business with. He swallowed hard and whispered a single devastating name into the dark garage. William Kensington. The revelation hit me like a runaway freight train. The corporate war was no longer just about a greedy daughter-in-law. The name William Kensington echoed relentlessly in my mind the entire drive back to my empty house. Meredith's father was not just a wealthy man. He was a ruthless corporate vulture, a notorious real estate mogul who specialized in devouring distressed assets and liquidating vulnerable companies for parts. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together. Meredith had not orchestrated this massive financial coup alone. She was not the architect of this betrayal. She was merely the Trojan horse acting as the inside operative for her father's predatory empire. The very next morning, I arrived at Iron Root Logistics headquarters before the sun had even fully crested the horizon. I instructed my executive assistant to hold all my calls and sat behind my desk, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the true mastermind behind my son's destruction. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of my executive suite swung open. William Kensington walked into my office as if his name was already engraved on the side of the building. He wore a bespoke navy pinstripe suit and carried a slim leather folio. He did not bother to introduce himself. He marched directly to my desk and dropped the forged loan documents onto the polished glass surface. The paperwork was thick-bound with heavy legal staples and bore the unmistakable seal of his private equity firm. He looked down at me with a sickeningly familiar smile of absolute entitlement, fully expecting me to cower in the presence of his overwhelming financial leverage. "Good morning, Lawrence," Kensington said, his voice a smooth, calculated drawl that masked his predatory nature. "I assume your lawyers have already informed you of your current predicament. My firm now holds a multi-million-dollar lien against your primary commercial warehouses secured by your late wife's amended will and your son's legal signature. You are functionally bankrupt on paper, and I own the concrete your trucks park on." He leaned over my desk, resting his knuckles on the glass, attempting to use his physical size to project dominance. He expected me to panic. He expected the desperate, sweating reaction of an old man watching his life's work evaporate. Instead, I simply looked at his manicured hands and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, familiar boredom. Kensington severely misunderstood the era in which I forged my resilience. My mind drifted back to the brutal trucking wars of the 1980s. Gwendolyn and I had faced down men exactly like William Kensington. Powerful, wealthy white men who actively conspired with corrupt state regulators to run black-owned transportation businesses out of the region. They leveraged banks against us, paid off local politicians to revoke our permits, slashed our tires in the dead of night, and tried to bleed us dry with predatory insurance rates. I had looked into the eyes of men far more dangerous than the pampered real estate mogul standing in front of me, and I had buried every single one of them in the dust of my success. Kensington's wealth did not intimidate me. It merely confirmed exactly what kind of parasite I was dealing with. I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers, completely unfazed by his theatrical display of stolen power. "You seem remarkably calm for a man whose empire is currently resting on a legal guillotine." Kensington noted his arrogant smile faltering for a fraction of a second as he realized his intimidation tactics were completely failing. "But let us skip the posturing. I am a pragmatic businessman, and I recognize that prolonged legal battles are messy for everyone involved. I am prepared to offer you a graceful exit." He pulled a single sheet of paper from his slim leather folio and slid it across the desk toward me. It was a formal buyout offer. I glanced at the number printed at the bottom of the page. It was an insulting absolute joke. He was offering exactly 10 cents on the dollar for a logistics network worth tens of millions, completely stripping away the generational wealth Gwendolyn and I had built. "You will sign over your remaining executive voting shares and completely relinquish all claims to the physical depots," Kensington instructed, his tone shifting into a harsh, dictatorial command. "In exchange, my firm will absorb Darren's massive loan and you will walk away with enough pocket change to fund a quiet, pathetic retirement." I did not touch the paper. I simply stared at him. If you refuse this generous offer, Kensington continued, his voice dropping into a vicious, unmistakable threat, I will unleash an army of corporate litigators. We will bury Iron Root Logistics in endless discovery motions, fraud accusations, and asset injunctions. I will personally ensure this company is tangled in the court system for decades. You are 70 years old, Lawrence. You do not have the time, the energy, or the remaining lifespan to fight me. I will legally bleed you dry until you die of old age, and then I will take the company from your estate anyway. Sign the paper and walk away with your remaining dignity, or watch everything you love burn to the ground. The air in the room grew heavy and completely still. Kensington stood tall, fully believing he had delivered the ultimate, inescapable checkmate. I looked at the insulting buyout offer, then looked at my half-full mug of black coffee resting on the corner of my desk. I picked up the mug, stood up slowly, and walked past Kensington without uttering a single word. I walked directly to the small wet bar in the corner of my executive suite. I tilted the mug and poured the dark coffee straight down the stainless steel sink, watching it swirl down the drain. That is exactly what I think of your generous offer, William, I said, setting the empty mug down with a sharp, decisive clack. I turned to face him, drawing a line in the sand that could never be uncrossed. You think you can march into my building holding forged papers and steal 40 years of my blood. You think your expensive lawyers and your predatory money scare me. You have absolutely no idea what kind of war you have just started. I will break your firm piece by piece, and I will make sure your daughter watches it happen. I will not sign your pathetic document, and I will not surrender a single inch of my asphalt to a parasite like you. Get out of my building before I have my security team throw you through the front glass. Kensington's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. The fake professional courtesy completely vanished, replaced by the ruthless aggression of a corporate predator. He slowly picked up his rejected buyout offer and slid it back into his leather folio. You have made a fatal mistake, old man Kensington whispered, a cold, dangerous smile creeping across his face. I will enjoy tearing you apart. He turned on his heel and marched out of my office, immediately pulling out his cell phone to initiate a full-scale hostile takeover protocol. William Kensington did not waste time licking his wounds. He immediately deployed the one weapon he understood perfectly: liquid capital. By Tuesday morning, the ruthless effects of his hostile takeover protocol began tearing through the upper echelons of Iron Route Logistics. Kensington systematically targeted my most senior operational staff, offering them massive, unrefusable signing bonuses to defect to his own shadowy shell companies. My secure phone line rang constantly with uncomfortable, apologetic voices. First, it was the regional fleet manager for the Eastern Seaboard, a man I had personally trained 20 years ago. He cited vague personal reasons for his sudden departure, but I knew Kensington had bought his loyalty with a heavy briefcase of cash. Then the primary dispatchers started resigning in synchronized waves. These were the vital nerve centers of my empire, the men and women who coordinated the complex ballet of thousands of trucks moving across the country. Without them, the logistical gridlock was immediate and devastating. Trucks sat idle in staging yards, missing their critical delivery windows. Major corporate clients began calling, furious over the sudden delays in their supply chains. Kensington was actively bleeding my company dry, expertly suffocating the daily operations to force my complete surrender. He wanted me to watch my life's work collapse in real time, proving that his predatory wealth could crush my decades of hard labor in a matter of days. The financial hemorrhage was catastrophic. Within 48 hours, Iron Route Logistics had hemorrhaged millions of dollars in breached contract penalties and lost revenue. I sat in my quiet, dimly lit office, staring at the cascading red numbers on my primary terminal. Jonathan paced heavily across the expensive carpet, his usually stoic demeanor cracking under the immense pressure of Kensington's legal siege. Lawrence, we need to seriously consider strategic capitulation, Jonathan advised, his voice tight with genuine concern. Kensington has unlimited capital to fund this war of attrition. He is perfectly willing to destroy the company entirely just to sell off the scrap metal. If we negotiate a settlement now, you might retain a fraction of your wealth. I did not look away from the glowing screen. I did not feel fear. Instead, my mind traveled back to a rainy evening in 1998. Gwendolyn was sitting exactly where I sat now, furiously typing away at her heavy desktop computer after a vicious corporate rival attempted a similar, albeit much smaller, hostile buyout. She had looked at me with her piercing, brilliant eyes and declared that no parasite would ever steal our throne. She had spent the next 3 months working with top-tier corporate defense attorneys to bury a highly aggressive shareholder rights plan deep within the foundational corporate bylaws. It was a sophisticated, dormant legal landmine known in the financial sector as a poison pill. Gwendolyn had designed it for this exact catastrophic scenario. It required my absolute executive authorization to activate, and once triggered, it was completely irreversible. I closed the financial dashboard on my monitor and looked up at Jonathan. "We are not settling for a single dime," I told my lawyer with absolute certainty. "Kensington thinks he bought my company. We are about to teach him the brutal cost of that purchase." Before Jonathan could respond to my declaration, the heavy glass doors of my executive suite swung open with violent force. Darren marched into the room, his chest puffed out with a sickening, unearned arrogance. He was flanked by 3 sharp-suited corporate litigators, Kensington's personal attack dogs who carried thick stacks of legal injunctions. Darren had completely shed his cowardly demeanor from the night of his arrest. Backed by his father-in-law's immense wealth and predatory legal team, my son genuinely believed he had returned as the conquering king. He walked directly to my desk, slamming a heavy set of brass keys onto the glass surface. "The game is officially over, Dad," Darren announced, his voice dripping with a pathetic attempt at mimicking Kensington's ruthless tone. "We have successfully acquired the resignations of your entire senior management team. The fleet is paralyzed, and the corporate board has called an emergency session to formally strip you of your remaining executive authority. You are trespassing in my building." I remained perfectly still in my leather chair, observing the profound delusion radiating from my biological son. He actually thought he had engineered this victory. He did not realize he was merely the disposable pawn Kensington was using to bypass the standard acquisition laws. One of the sharp-suited lawyers stepped forward, placing a formal eviction notice on top of the brass keys. "Mr. Lawrence," the lawyer stated with clinical precision, "we are executing the collateral seizure on behalf of our client, William Kensington. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather your personal belongings and vacate these premises. If you refuse, building security will forcibly remove you." Darren crossed his arms, staring down at me with a triumphant, malicious sneer. "Leave the keys, Dad," he demanded, "and do not bother taking the company car. We have already canceled your insurance policy." I looked at the eviction notice, then at the brass keys, and finally at the foolish boy I had raised. He had brought a knife to a nuclear detonation. I did not reach for the brass keys. I calmly opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a heavy red leather-bound folder that had not seen the light of day in over 2 decades. I placed it deliberately on the glass surface right next to their pathetic eviction notice. "You severely underestimate the brilliant woman who gave birth to you, Darren," I said, my voice echoing with a low, dangerous resonance. "Gwendolyn knew that one day a weak, greedy man might try to steal what we built. She engineered a fail-safe specifically designed to annihilate hostile takeovers." I flipped open the red folder, revealing the original notarized execution documents for the shareholder rights plan. I picked up my heavy gold pen and signed my name with bold, sweeping strokes on the final authorization line. Jonathan immediately pulled out his secure tablet, inputting the execution codes directly into the corporate registry. "What did you just do?" Darren demanded, his arrogant posture faltering as he watched Jonathan's rapid, calculated movements. The lead lawyer's face suddenly drained of all color as his phone vibrated violently with an emergency market alert. "I just activated the poison pill," I explained smoothly, leaning back in my chair to watch their destruction unfold. "The corporate registry has just flooded the internal market with millions of new, heavily discounted shares available exclusively to the original loyal stakeholders. In a matter of 10 seconds, the stolen equity you used as collateral has been aggressively and permanently diluted. Your massive percentage of the company has just been reduced to a fraction of a single percent. The staggering multi-million-dollar valuation Kensington thought he controlled is now worth absolutely nothing but worthless pennies. You do not own my building, Darren. You owe William Kensington an 8-figure loan backed by entirely worthless paper, and he is going to absolutely destroy you for it." The fallout from the poison pill execution was instantaneous and violently explosive. William Kensington did not simply absorb the massive financial blow with professional grace. The moment his elite legal team confirmed his newly acquired equity was functionally worthless, he retaliated with the full, unfettered weight of his corrupt political network. Within 24 hours of Darren fleeing my office in sheer terror, a heavily armed county sheriff arrived at my front door bearing a thick stack of court orders. Kensington had bypassed the standard legal channels and directly leveraged a notoriously corrupt local judge he had been heavily funding for over a decade. This judge issued a sweeping draconian emergency injunction without holding a single preliminary hearing. The legal hammer dropped with devastating precision. The injunction did not merely halt the dilution of the corporate shares. It froze absolutely everything attached to my name. My primary operational accounts, my personal checking and savings, the emergency lines of credit, and even the modest retirement funds I kept completely separate from the logistics empire were aggressively locked. The banks immediately suspended my access to the grid. I was entirely cut off from the global financial system. Kensington intended to starve me into submission, actively weaponizing the corrupt justice system to bypass my corporate defenses and completely paralyze my ability to fight back. The immediate practical consequences of the financial freeze manifested with terrifying speed. By the end of the week, stark red disconnection notices arrived in my mailbox from the local utility companies. The automated billing systems for my estate's electricity, water, and gas had completely bounced. I was sitting in my dark living room, wrapped in a thick wool sweater to conserve the remaining ambient heat, listening to the heavy silence of a house rapidly losing its pulse. My desk phone rang, breaking the quiet. It was Jonathan. He informed me with profound professional regret that his law firm could no longer represent me in court without receiving an immediate massive retainer to counter Kensington's endless legal motions. I was functionally destitute on paper, unable to buy a single loaf of bread or legally pay the brilliant attorney currently keeping me out of a prison cell. However, Kensington severely underestimated the deep, generational paranoia of a black woman who grew up during the civil rights struggles of the Deep South. Gwendolyn fundamentally distrusted the modern banking system. She always anticipated a day when the institutions we built our empire on might suddenly turn against us. Decades ago, long before Iron Route Logistics became a national powerhouse, she quietly opened a physical safety deposit box at a tiny, unlisted community bank in a rural neighboring county. She opened it exclusively under her maiden name, keeping it entirely disconnected from our corporate tax returns and joint marital assets. Every few months, for over 30 years, my brilliant wife had silently converted small fractions of our surplus cash into solid gold bullion and untraceable $100 bills, locking them away in the dark for a rainy day exactly like this one. The following morning, I stood near the edge of my living room window looking out through the thick curtains at my usually pristine front lawn. Without the automated sprinkler system or the weekly landscaping service I could no longer afford to pay, the grass had rapidly grown tall and unkempt. Dead autumn leaves accumulated heavily across the driveway, creating a visible picture of sudden, undeniable neglect. As I watched the cold wind scatter the debris, a gleaming new luxury SUV slowly crept down my quiet residential street. The vehicle idled directly in front of my property. The tinted passenger window rolled down smoothly, revealing Meredith. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses and holding a high-definition digital camera with a massive telephoto lens. She brazenly aimed the lens at my overgrown lawn, my dark windows, and the pile of uncollected mail spilling out of the brass mailbox. Her strategy was sickeningly transparent. She was not just gloating over my manufactured poverty. She was actively compiling a damning photographic portfolio to present to the corrupt judge. She intended to use the forced deterioration of my property as irrefutable visual evidence that I was rapidly losing my mind. She would weave a compelling, tragic narrative for the court, claiming that my severe cognitive decline was resulting in extreme self-neglect and absolute financial ruin. She was diligently building the precise legal framework to justify locking me in a psychiatric ward and granting Darren full conservatorship over my life. I watched her snap dozens of photos, a cruel, triumphant smirk plastered across her face. She truly believed her father's brutal injunction had completely broken my spirit, reducing me to a helpless old man trapped inside a decaying, freezing house. I did not step outside to confront her. I did not give her the satisfaction of capturing my anger on film. I simply let the heavy curtain fall back into place, turned away from the window, and prepared to execute my next countermeasure. I drove my old unregistered backup truck to the neighboring county, blending perfectly into the rural landscape. The small community bank was completely deserted. I accessed Gwendolyn's secret lockbox using the heavy brass key I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out book in my study. The box was heavy, packed tightly with gleaming gold bars and thick stacks of crisp, untraceable currency. I liquidated a portion of the gold through an independent, discreet broker who asked absolutely no questions and dealt strictly in cash. I walked out with a heavy briefcase containing enough liquid capital to completely bypass Kensington's legal stranglehold. I did not use this money to pay my overdue electric bill or hire a standard corporate defense attorney. Standard attorneys played by the rules, and Kensington was openly cheating. I needed someone who operated entirely outside the traditional boundaries of the law. Using an encrypted messaging protocol Gwendolyn had shown me years ago, I contacted a highly recommended, notoriously ruthless underground forensic accountant known only as Silas. He did not work for law firms or corporate boards. He worked exclusively in the shadows, dismantling the financial architecture of corrupt politicians and predatory billionaires. We met in a dark, empty diner on the edge of the city limits. I slid a thick envelope containing $50,000 in untraceable cash across the sticky table. I want every single dark, secret, illegal offshore shell company and money laundering operation connected to William Kensington, I told Silas, locking eyes with the cold, analytical man. Dig straight through the concrete and find the bodies. Silas pocketed the cash, gave a brief, terrifying nod, and vanished into the night, ready to completely eviscerate Kensington's empire. 3 days later, I sat on a freezing park bench at the edge of the city botanical gardens. The morning mist was thick, obscuring the path ahead. Silas appeared from the gray fog without making a single sound. He did not sit beside me. He simply walked past, dropping a small, heavy, encrypted black flash drive into my open palm before disappearing back into the mist. I returned to my dark, unheated house and plugged the drive into my secure offline laptop. Silas was worth every single dollar of the cash I had given him. He had bypassed Kensington's highly paid corporate defense walls and completely gutted the man's financial history. The data on the screen was absolute poison. William Kensington was not a brilliant real estate mogul. He was an incredibly sophisticated criminal. His entire empire was built on a massive illegal network of offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. He had spent the last 2 decades aggressively laundering illicit money for overseas syndicates, funneling the dirty cash through his domestic real estate acquisitions to wash it clean. The hostile takeover of Iron Route Logistics was not just about expanding his portfolio. Kensington needed my vast nationwide trucking network to physically move illicit goods and launder untraceable cash across state lines. My company was meant to be his ultimate washing machine. He was using his daughter's marriage to my son as a convenient backdoor into a perfectly clean, legitimate enterprise. I spent the next 48 hours staring at the glowing monitor, meticulously tracking the digital breadcrumbs Silas had unearthed. I wrapped myself in Gwendolyn's old quilt to fight off the freezing chill of the unheated house, channeling her absolute brilliance for accounting. She had always told me that money leaves a permanent footprint, no matter how hard criminals try to erase it in the sand. I traced the massive wire transfers from the Cayman accounts directly into domestic shell corporations. From those shadow entities, the money flowed seamlessly into a private family trust. The sole beneficiary of that specific trust was Meredith. I mapped out the exact, undeniable flow of the dirty funds paying for her entire luxurious lifestyle. The extravagant honeymoon, the $50,000 designer, watches the massive cash down payment on their house, and the exorbitant legal retainers currently trying to steal my company were all entirely funded by international money laundering. Meredith was not just a greedy, racist daughter-in-law demanding an unearned inheritance. She was actively living off the proceeds of a massive federal crime, and the paper trail explicitly proved she had knowingly signed the tax documents to receive the funds. She and Darren had marched into my home threatening to lock me in a psychiatric ward, while completely unaware they were leaving a blatant trail of federal felonies right at my front door. I compiled the offshore routing numbers, the forged tax returns, and the wire transfer receipts into a single devastating physical dossier. I was no longer fighting a corporate battle. I was holding the detonator to Kensington's entire freedom. I used my last remaining burner phone to call William Kensington's private executive line. When he answered, I kept my voice weak, purposely injecting a pathetic tremble into my words to play the part of a broken, defeated man. I told him my house was freezing, my accounts were completely dead, and my lawyers had entirely abandoned me. I practically begged him to meet me at a high-end neutral steakhouse in the financial district to finalize the surrender of Iron Route Logistics. Kensington agreed instantly, a sickeningly triumphant chuckle escaping his throat before he hung up. I arrived at the restaurant exactly 30 minutes early. I wore my finest tailored charcoal suit, projecting absolute power, a sharp contrast to the pathetic beggar I had portrayed on the phone. I secured a private soundproof dining room at the back of the establishment, far away from the prying eyes of the main dining floor. At precisely noon, Kensington walked through the heavy mahogany doors. He looked incredibly smug, wearing a custom silk tie and carrying the same leather folio containing his insulting buyout offer. He expected to find a shivering, destitute old man, ready to sign away his legacy for pennies, just to get the heat turned back on. Kensington sat down across from me, signaling the waiter to bring an expensive bottle of champagne to celebrate his supposed victory. He pulled his legal documents from the folio and placed a heavy silver pen on the pristine white tablecloth. "You finally came to your senses," Lawrence Kensington said, leaning back in his chair with supreme arrogant satisfaction. "It is a terrible shame you forced me to freeze your assets and embarrass you publicly. If you had just signed these papers last week, you could have spared yourself the indignity of starving in the dark. Now sign the transfer and I will gladly call my judge to unfreeze your bank accounts before dinner." I did not reach for his silver pen. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper from the dossier Silas had compiled. I slid the paper smoothly across the white tablecloth, stopping it directly on top of his hostile takeover documents. Kensington looked down with a dismissive smirk, but the moment his eyes registered the offshore routing numbers, the exact dates of the Cayman wire transfers, and the names of his illegal shell companies, all the blood completely drained from his arrogant face. His smug expression shattered into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The champagne arrived, but Kensington could not even speak to acknowledge the waiter. "The game is over, William," I said, my voice dropping into a cold, lethal register. "I hold a secure flash drive containing decades of your money laundering operations. I demand 3 things right now. First, you will call your corrupt judge and completely drop the injunction against my assets. Second, you will sign a legally binding document relinquishing absolutely all claims, liens, and interests regarding Iron Root Logistics. Third, and most importantly, you will completely sever Meredith from your financial trusts immediately. You will cut your own daughter off from every single cent you own, leaving her absolutely penniless to face me alone. If you refuse even one of these demands, I will walk out of this restaurant and hand the flash drive directly to the federal authorities. You will die in a federal penitentiary." Kensington stared at the routing numbers, trembling violently. He realized I held his entire life in my hands. Without uttering a single word of protest, he picked up his silver pen, frantically signed away his claims to my company, and effectively disowned his own daughter to save himself from prison. William Kensington was a man who understood leverage, and the moment he signed those papers, he recognized that Meredith was no longer an asset. She was a massive, bleeding liability. True to his predatory nature, he executed the financial decapitation immediately. The very next morning, the trust funds paying for Meredith and Darren's luxurious lifestyle were entirely drained and permanently closed. Kensington's legal team formally withdrew from the conservatorship lawsuit, leaving my son and his wife completely exposed and entirely broke. Driven by sheer panic and a desperate need to reclaim some form of control, Darren resorted to street-level tactics. He scraped together whatever remaining cash he could pull from his personal accounts and hired a low-tier, highly aggressive private security firm. These were not polished corporate guards. They were desperate men willing to overlook legalities for a handful of untraceable bills. Darren deployed them to the primary Iron Root Logistics warehouse on the industrial edge of the city. Before dawn, they erected heavy steel barricades across the main loading bays, physically locking down the entire facility. They chained the massive rolling gates shut and stood shoulder to shoulder in cheap tactical gear, gripping heavy batons. Darren had effectively taken his own father's company hostage, intending to use millions of dollars in stalled freight as his final pathetic bargaining chip. I received the frantic call from my night shift dispatcher just after 5 in the morning. I did not panic. I simply put on my heavy wool coat and drove directly to the warehouse. When I arrived, the staging yard was a tense standoff. Dozens of my truck drivers were parked outside the barricades, furious and demanding access to their rigs. 2 of the hired guards stepped forward as I approached the locked gate, raising their batons defensively and warning me to step back. I looked past them, staring at the massive concrete structure looming in the early morning fog. Darren had no idea what he was actually trying to hold hostage. Drip Feed, 35 years ago before Iron Root became a national name, Gwendolyn and I bought that specific plot of land when it was nothing but an abandoned dirt lot. I had physically drafted the architectural blueprints for that warehouse on my kitchen table. I stood over the shoulders of the electricians as they laid the conduit, demanding a specialized, highly redundant power grid that would prevent total shutdowns during harsh winter storms. I knew where every single copper wire breaker box and municipal connection was located because I had paid for them with my own blood and sweat. Darren was standing inside a fortress I had built with my own hands, completely oblivious to the fact that I still held the master controls. Darren emerged from the loading bay doors holding a bright yellow megaphone. He walked toward the chain-link fence, trying to project authority, but his hands were shaking so violently that the megaphone rattled against his mouth. He looked exhausted, terrified, and cornered. The luxury suits and the arrogant sneer were gone, replaced by the desperate, sweating reality of a man who realized his entire life was collapsing. He raised the megaphone, addressing the angry crowd of drivers and focusing directly on me. "Listen to me, Dad," Darren shouted, his voice cracking and echoing harshly across the concrete yard. "I have secured this facility and I am not leaving until you compensate me for what you have taken. I want a formal, legally binding severance package. I want $5 million wired directly into a secure offshore account by noon today, and I want full legal immunity from any fraud charges. If you refuse, I will order these men to slash the tires on every single rig in this yard, and I will personally set fire to the freight in the loading bays." He was actively threatening to destroy millions of dollars in customer property and permanently cripple the livelihoods of the men standing outside the gate. The truck drivers erupted in furious shouts, surging toward the barricades, ready to tear the private guards apart. I raised my hand, demanding absolute silence from my crew. I did not yell back at Darren. I did not engage in a screaming match over a megaphone or negotiate with a terrorist. I simply pulled my encrypted company iPad from my leather briefcase and unlocked the screen. I tapped into the secured application that directly interfaced with the municipal power grid for our industrial sector. Because I had designed the facility's architecture myself, I had integrated the warehouse's primary breakers into an override system controlled directly by my executive credentials. I did not say a single word to my son. I tapped the bright red icon labeled Main Breaker Disconnect. A heavy, resounding clunk echoed from the transformer station behind the warehouse. Instantly, the massive floodlights illuminating the yard completely died. The hum of the massive industrial refrigerators inside the loading bays ceased immediately. The heavy electronic bay doors froze in place, unable to open or close. I then accessed the digital controls for the underground diesel reserves. I initiated an emergency lockdown protocol, permanently disabling the electronic fuel pumps. The warehouse was completely neutralized. It was no longer a functional multi-million-dollar logistics hub. I had instantly reduced it to a dark, freezing, entirely useless concrete box. The hired guards nervously looked around as the darkness enveloped the facility, suddenly realizing they were defending a dead zone. I looked through the chain-link fence at Darren, who was staring at the dead floodlights in pure, unadulterated horror. "You do not hold any hostages, Darren," I said quietly, my voice carrying easily in the sudden silence of the dead warehouse. "You are just a broke, scared boy, locked inside a dark cage, and the men you hired expect to be paid by the hour." I turned my back on the fence, walked back to my car, and waited for his cheap army to realize their general had absolutely no money to pay them. The temperature inside the massive loading bays began to rise immediately after I severed the power grid. The heavy silence of the dead warehouse was soon broken by the dripping of melting condensation from the ceiling of the massive refrigerated units. Millions of dollars in premium perishable cargo dairy, specialized pharmaceuticals, and fresh produce were rapidly ticking toward total catastrophic spoilage. The hired private security guards stood in the dim light of the early dawn, their breath misting in the cold air, completely unnerved by the sudden and absolute darkness. They were not loyal corporate soldiers. They were cheap mercenaries who operated strictly on a cash basis. The head of the security detail, a heavily scarred man with a thick neck and zero patience for corporate drama, marched directly up to my son. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at Darren's chest, demanding the immediate hourly cash payment they had agreed upon before erecting the heavy steel barricades. Darren had promised them triple their usual security rate to illegally hold the facility, a dangerous financial pledge to make to highly dangerous men. The guard made it absolutely clear that his team did not care about family disputes, legal injunctions, or logistics contracts. They had locked down a commercial facility, risked severe federal trespassing charges, and they wanted their money right that exact second. Darren's fake bravado evaporated completely. He patted his pockets frantically, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead as the aggressive guards closed in around him in the dark staging yard. Darren desperately pulled a thick leather wallet from his jacket, his hands shaking so violently he dropped several cards onto the cold concrete. He scrambled to retrieve a sleek black corporate credit card, holding it up like a protective shield against the advancing mercenaries. He stammered, offering to run the payment through the security firm's mobile application, promising a massive cash bonus for the temporary inconvenience of the power outage. The head guard pulled a heavy reinforced smartphone from his tactical vest and forcefully swiped Darren's card through the attached digital reader. The screen flashed a bright, undeniable red error message, indicating the account was permanently closed. Darren swallowed hard, frantically handing over a personal platinum card, then a high-limit gold rewards card, and finally a standard checking debit card. Every single piece of plastic triggered the exact same brutal digital response. The financial guillotine I had orchestrated alongside my banking contacts was absolute. Darren possessed absolutely zero liquid capital to his name. The heavy silence in the yard shifted into a dangerous, palpable hostility. The head guard stared down at the useless plastic in his hand, then looked directly into Darren's terrified eyes. He slowly crushed the final credit card between his thumb and forefinger, dropping the broken pieces onto the oil-stained pavement. The guards realized simultaneously that they had been completely played. They were not providing tactical security for a wealthy corporate executive executing a hostile takeover. They were risking serious prison time for a broke, desperate fraudster who could not even afford to buy them a single cup of coffee. The men tightened their grips on their heavy batons, taking a synchronized step forward. Darren was completely surrounded, cut off from the main road, and entirely at the mercy of the violent men he had recklessly hired. I watched the entire escalating confrontation from the warm, quiet interior of my sedan parked just 50 yards away. I rolled my window down, letting the crisp morning air carry the sound of the inevitable betrayal. The head guard grabbed Darren roughly by the collar of his expensive jacket, hauling him violently toward the heavy chain-link gates. The mercenary did not waste time screaming or making empty verbal threats. He shoved my son face first into the cold steel mesh, pressing the heavy handle of his baton against the base of Darren's spine. The demand was simple and violently clear. The guards wanted to leave the property immediately without attracting a massive police presence, and they needed the heavy barricades removed to exit the perimeter cleanly. He ordered Darren to manually unchain the gates and dismantle the steel barricades right that very second. Darren scrambled like a terrified rat trapped in a maze. He fumbled frantically with the heavy iron padlock, his manicured fingers bleeding against the rusted metal. The heavy chains hit the concrete with a loud, ringing crash. He pushed the massive rolling gates open with his shoulder, panting heavily, completely stripped of his unearned arrogance and his fake corporate power. The head guard signaled his men with a sharp whistle. They piled into their unmarked tactical vehicles and sped out of the industrial park without giving Darren a second glance. The path was completely clear. I shifted my sedan into drive and slowly rolled through the open gates, my tires crushing the broken pieces of Darren's discarded credit cards. I stopped the vehicle exactly parallel to my son. He stood by the chain-link fence, panting, completely broken and entirely exposed to the cold wind. He looked at me expecting bitter anger or a triumphant lecture. I gave him absolutely nothing. I merely looked through the windshield at the dark, silent warehouse I had just reclaimed. The sheer, terrifying weight of my total indifference shattered his remaining nerve. Darren turned away from my vehicle and ran. He sprinted down the long, empty industrial road, fleeing the property on foot like a common trespasser, abandoning his entire life's ambition in the cold morning fog. I spent the next 2 hours restoring the municipal power grid from my tablet, rescuing the perishable cargo, and personally welcoming my loyal drivers back onto the staging yard. The company was secure. I drove back to my corporate headquarters expecting to spend the afternoon reviewing the damage the brief siege had caused. I walked into my executive suite ready to instruct Jonathan on our next aggressive legal maneuver. I did not find my lawyer waiting for me. A strange man was sitting casually on the edge of my receptionist's desk. He was a tall, heavily tattooed individual wearing a faded denim jacket reeking of stale tobacco and cheap alcohol. He possessed the exact same pale blue eyes and sharp jawline as the infant Meredith had tried to use to steal my empire. This was the biological father, a disgruntled former mechanic who had been fired from Iron Root Logistics 3 years ago for chronic theft. He stood up as I approached, blocking the door to my private office with a sickeningly familiar sense of entitlement. He did not ask for a polite meeting. He demanded a conversation in a harsh, gravelly voice, making it instantly clear that he was not here to apologize for his past transgressions. He aggressively demanded a massive sum of hush money, revealing a fatal flaw in Meredith's grand design. She had promised this man a generous 7-figure cut of my corporate fortune to stay completely quiet about their sordid affair and the true paternity of the child. Now that Kensington had cut Meredith off and Darren was entirely broke, the biological father had come directly to the source to collect his promised payday. The biological father, whose name I later learned was Darnell, leaned aggressively across my receptionist's desk, his posture radiating a dangerous mix of desperation and malice. He did not care about corporate decorum or legal threats. He slapped a thick manila folder onto the desk, claiming it contained undeniable proof of his affair with Meredith, including text messages, hotel receipts, and the original unmodified DNA test she had hidden from everyone. He demanded $2 million in untraceable cash by the end of the week, or he would go directly to the national press and expose the entire sordid scandal, completely destroying the Kensington name and humiliating Iron Route Logistics in the process. I listened to his extortion attempt with cold, calculated amusement. I informed Darnell quite truthfully that I did not care if he published the story on the front page of every newspaper in the country. The scandal would only further isolate Meredith and Darren, cementing my total victory. I told him to take his extortion demands directly to the woman who actually owed him the money. Darnell left my office furious, immediately dialing Meredith's number. Backed into an absolute corner, completely cut off by her father's massive wealth and legally bound to a husband who possessed zero liquid capital. Meredith panicked. She needed $2 million immediately, and she had absolutely nowhere left to turn but the very company she had tried to steal. I sat in my secure home office later that evening, sipping a glass of bourbon and actively monitoring the company's internal network traffic on my encrypted server. I was not actively searching for an intrusion. I was patiently waiting for one. Drip feed. 30 years ago, when Iron Route first began offering a comprehensive employee pension plan, Gwendolyn insisted on absolute paranoid security. She deeply distrusted external fund managers. She personally designed a highly sophisticated silent digital tripwire that wrapped around the central pension accounts. It was an invisible, archaic line of code that triggered a silent alarm directly to my personal terminal the absolute second any unauthorized user attempted to access the restricted funds. Meredith, desperate and out of options, believed she was a modern digital mastermind. She assumed the old legacy systems Gwendolyn built were outdated and easily bypassed. Using the administrative credentials she had previously stolen from Darren, she logged into the corporate mainframe from an untraceable IP address, attempting to masquerade as an external financial auditor. She systematically navigated through the labyrinth of corporate accounts, bypassing the standard operational funds, which were heavily monitored, and targeting the massive dormant pool of cash sitting in the employee pension reserves. She intended to siphon off the $2 million in a series of rapid, obfuscated wire transfers, funneling the money into a decentralized cryptocurrency wallet to pay off Darnell. She believed she was executing a flawless, untraceable heist. The silent alarm on my encrypted terminal flashed a brilliant pulsing red. Gwendolyn's 30-year-old tripwire had caught the rat perfectly. The screen displayed the exact, agonizingly slow progress of Meredith's digital intrusion. I watched as she successfully bypassed the first layer of security, entering Darren's stolen administrative overrides. She hesitated for a fraction of a second at the final authorization screen, likely sweating profusely, realizing the sheer magnitude of the crime she was about to commit. Then, driven by the absolute terror of Darnell exposing her lies to her father and the public, she initiated the massive wire transfer. $2 million began to slowly drain from the employee pension fund, breaking the transaction into 50 smaller staggered payments designed to avoid automatic banking flags. A lesser man, a CEO solely focused on protecting his immediate assets, would have instantly slammed the digital kill switch. I could have easily blocked the transaction, locked her out of the system entirely, and saved the $2 million before a single cent left the corporate accounts. But blocking the transfer would merely result in a failed attempt to slap on the wrist a corporate reprimand that a clever lawyer might easily dismiss as a technical glitch or an accidental keystroke by a careless employee. I did not want to slap her wrist. I wanted to completely and permanently annihilate her ability to ever threaten my family or my legacy again. I leaned back in my leather chair, folded my hands, and watched the progress bar slowly fill. I did not touch the keyboard. I intentionally allowed the massive illegal wire transfer to completely process. I watched the $2 million successfully exit the Iron Root Logistics pension fund and vanish into the digital ether. By allowing the transaction to finalize, I transformed Meredith's desperate attempt at theft into a fully executed textbook federal wire fraud felony. She had crossed state lines, digitally stolen from a federally protected employee pension fund, and utilized an electronic banking network to launder the stolen assets. The evidence was irrefutable, crystal clear, and permanently logged in the unalterable history of the corporate servers. I immediately triggered an automated, highly detailed security report that compiled the exact IP address, the stolen administrative credentials, the precise timestamps, and the decentralized routing numbers of her cryptocurrency wallet. I did not send this report to Jonathan, and I did not send it to the local police department. I bundled the entire digital dossier into a secure encrypted file and forwarded it directly to the Cybercrimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically flagging it as a massive intentional breach of a protected union pension fund. The trap had not just closed, it had completely crushed her. The $2 million successfully settled into the decentralized cryptocurrency wallet Meredith had hurriedly established. For a brief, highly diluted moment, she undoubtedly believed she had outsmarted us all. She successfully paid off her blackmailer, permanently silencing his threats of public exposure regarding the true paternity of her child. She likely poured herself a tall glass of expensive wine to celebrate her flawless execution of corporate theft. However, the federal government does not operate on the timeline of a relieved criminal. It moves with the slow crushing and absolute inevitability of a glacier. Exactly 48 hours after the illegal wire transfer cleared the blockchain, the automated regulatory alarms at the Department of Labor and the Federal Bureau of Investigation simultaneously tripped. A massive unauthorized drain on a union-protected employee pension fund is never treated as a simple accounting error. It is treated as an immediate, Tier 1 financial crime of the highest priority. The sheer volume of the stolen capital, combined with the heavily encrypted digital dossier I had anonymously forwarded directly to their Cybercrimes Division, ignited a massive and immediate federal response. Meredith genuinely thought she was a stealthy digital mastermind, but her digital fingerprints were painted in glowing neon across the federal databases. The trap had officially transitioned from a quiet, localized corporate dispute into a high-stakes criminal investigation with severe federal mandatory minimum sentencing. By Tuesday morning, the polished glass doors of Iron Root Logistics swung open to admit 3 men wearing dark, unassuming suits and carrying heavy gold federal badges. The lead investigator, Special Agent Reed, did not waste time with pleasantries or corporate courtesy. He marched directly into my executive suite and informed me that his division was launching a full-scale, uncompromising probe into a catastrophic breach of our employee pension accounts. A lesser corporate executive would have immediately called an army of defense attorneys, locked down the building, and stonewalled the investigation to protect the company reputation. I did the exact opposite. I welcomed Agent Reed into my office, offered him a fresh cup of black coffee, and pointed him directly toward the pristine, heavy-duty external hard drives sitting ready on my mahogany desk. I informed the federal agents that my internal security measures had already isolated the breach and tracked the exact origin of the theft. I handed over the unredacted server logs with absolute transparency. The digital evidence was totally irrefutable. The logs explicitly detailed how the intruder utilized Darren's specific executive administrative overrides to bypass the primary corporate firewalls. Furthermore, the routing data definitively traced the source of the hack directly back to the static IP address of the luxury suburban home Meredith and Darren shared. Agent Reed scrutinized the data, his professional demeanor shifting into a state of sharp, focused realization. The federal agents knew they were not looking at a complex international cyber syndicate. They were looking at a desperate, amateurish inside job perpetrated by my own family. They thanked me for my unprecedented cooperation and immediately secured emergency warrants to seize the digital assets at my son's residence. The federal strike was executed with brutal, unannounced precision. Just before midnight, I received a silent notification on my tablet that federal authorities had initiated a hard freeze on every single digital device and banking node associated with Meredith's home network. It did not take long for the crushing reality of the situation to completely shatter my son. At exactly 3 in the morning, the heavy, peaceful silence of my estate was interrupted by the frantic, violent pounding of fists against my solid oak front door. I checked the high-definition security monitors. Darren was standing on my porch, drenched in a freezing autumn rain that had begun to fall, looking exactly like a hunted animal with nowhere left to run. His expensive designer jacket was completely soaked, his hair was plastered to his forehead, and his face was twisted in an expression of absolute primal terror. I let him pound on the heavy wood for 10 full minutes, listening to his muffled, desperate screams echoing through the cold night air. "Dad, please open the door," he wailed, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. The agents were just here. They took all the computers. They took Meredith's phone and her hard drives. They said we stole from the union pension fund. "Please, you have to fix this right now." I watched him on the camera, utterly devoid of any paternal sympathy. This was the exact same man who had confidently marched into my office weeks ago, aggressively threatening to lock me in a psychiatric ward and seize my entire life's work. He had happily stood by while his wife slandered Gwendolyn's legacy and attempted to leave me completely destitute on the street. Now, facing the horrifying prospect of a 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, his fake corporate bravado had entirely evaporated. He was reduced to a weeping, pathetic shell, begging for his father to shield him from the monstrous consequences of his own boundless greed. I slowly unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the oak door open. The freezing rain blew onto the polished hardwood floor, but I did not invite my biological son inside the warmth of my home. Darren collapsed onto his knees on the wet porch, gripping the edge of my doorway, sobbing uncontrollably. He pleaded with me to use my corporate leverage to cover up the missing funds, frantically promising he would do whatever I wanted if I just made the federal agents disappear and drop the charges. I looked down at him with an expression of pure, unbreakable stone. I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a thick, legally binding folder Jonathan had prepared for me days in advance. I dropped the heavy document directly onto the wet porch right in front of his knees. "You do not dictate terms anymore," I stated, my voice slicing sharply through the sound of the falling rain. "I hold a secondary, highly encrypted drive containing the final, unassailable proof of your active complicity in the forged will and the hostile takeover. I am offering you exactly one singular path to avoid dying in a federal prison cell. You will sign that total, irrevocable surrender of all present and future inheritance rights to my estate. Furthermore, you will file for an immediate, uncontested divorce from Meredith by sunrise today. You will completely sever yourself from her toxic, criminal existence forever. If you hesitate for a single second, or if you refuse to sign away your fraudulent claims, I will personally hand that secondary drive to Agent Reed tomorrow morning. You will rot in a federal cell right next to your treacherous wife. The choice is entirely yours." Darren did not hesitate for a single second. The sheer paralyzing terror of a federal penitentiary completely overrode whatever remaining loyalty he held for his toxic wife. He snatched the heavy folder from the wet porch floor, his hands trembling violently in the cold wind, and pushed past me into the warmth of the kitchen. I did not offer him a towel to dry his soaking wet hair or a warm drink to calm his nerves. I simply handed him a heavy gold pen. Darren leaned over the pristine granite kitchen counter, freezing rainwater dripping from his expensive designer jacket onto the polished stone, and rapidly signed his name on every single flagged page. He scribbled furiously, fully grasping that his lavish lifestyle was officially dead. With those frantic, messy signatures, he legally stripped himself of all future inheritance, completely dissolved his massive trust fund, and permanently surrendered any remaining claim to Ironroot Logistics. He officially severed his bloodline from my empire. Next, he signed the expedited divorce filings Jonathan had meticulously prepared, effectively terminating his marriage with brutal legal efficiency. He left the corporate surrender documents on the counter, clutching the divorce papers tightly against his chest as if they were his only physical shield against the impending federal indictment. Without offering a single word of apology, remorse, or gratitude, my son turned and ran back out into the freezing rain, jumping into his vehicle to deliver the absolute worst news of Meredith's miserable life. Darren arrived at their luxury suburban home just as the early morning sun began to pierce the heavy storm clouds. He found Meredith pacing frantically in the center of their pristine living room, furiously dialing her estranged father's disconnected number. When Darren slapped the freshly signed divorce papers onto the glass coffee table, announcing that he had completely surrendered his inheritance to save himself from the FBI, Meredith did not break down in tears. She did not beg him to reconsider or fight to save their broken marriage. She reacted with the vicious, cold-blooded survival instinct of a cornered predator. She immediately began hurling heavy decorative objects across the room, screaming that he was a pathetic, useless coward who had ruined her entire life. Through the covert audio feeds my private security team had legally established on the corporate-issued devices, I listened to the spectacular destruction of their toxic union in real time. I was not surprised by her ruthless reaction. I always knew Meredith's loyalty was strictly transactional, heavily reliant on the continuous flow of unearned cash. Years ago, Gwendolyn had explicitly warned me that Meredith viewed human relationships entirely as financial contracts. The absolute second the money stopped flowing, her fake affection would instantly curdle into pure, unadulterated malice. Stripped of her corporate leverage, entirely cut off by her wealthy father, and now formally divorced by the man she had manipulated for years, Meredith realized she was entirely isolated. Facing a lengthy federal prison sentence for wire fraud, she calculated her absolute final maneuver. She grabbed her heavy coat and stormed out of the house, leaving Darren standing alone in the wreckage of his own foolish choices, fiercely determined to save her own skin at absolutely any cost. Meredith did not hire an expensive criminal defense attorney to fight the impending charges. She knew she possessed absolutely no funds to pay a premium legal retainer. Instead, she drove her vehicle directly to the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She marched straight into the austere lobby, demanding an immediate private meeting with Special Agent Reed. Meredith aggressively attempted to execute the ultimate betrayal, fully intending to strike a highly favorable plea deal by entirely throwing her newly estranged husband under the bus. Sitting in the sterile, brightly lit federal interrogation room, she presented a flawlessly rehearsed, completely fabricated narrative. She wept convincingly, playing the role of a terrified, obedient wife who had been heavily coerced into participating in the financial crimes. She explicitly told the federal agents that Darren was the sole calculating mastermind behind the massive union pension theft. She claimed he had violently forced her to execute the digital wire transfer, using his administrative overrides, directly threatening her physical safety if she refused to comply. Furthermore, to sweeten her treacherous deal, Meredith handed the agents highly detailed information regarding the forged amendment to Gwendolyn's will. She falsely testified that Darren had personally paid the corrupt notary to stamp the fraudulent documents, effectively framing him for the massive real estate fraud as well. She formally offered to testify against him in open federal court, aggressively demanding absolute immunity from prosecution in exchange for handing them the heir to the Iron Root logistics empire on a silver platter. She genuinely believed her manufactured tears and her willingness to completely destroy Darren's life would secure her immediate freedom. She completely underestimated the meticulous thoroughness of federal investigators who strictly required hard, physical evidence to corroborate her malicious accusations before signing any binding immunity agreements. Agent Reed listened to her entire treacherous confession with an unreadable, stony expression, quietly documenting every single lie she eagerly provided to damn her own husband. She assumed she had successfully outsmarted the entire federal justice system. Armed with Meredith's devastating accusations, Agent Reed immediately dispatched a tactical unit to detain Darren for intensive questioning. Federal agents intercepted my son just as he was attempting to pack a suitcase in his sprawling, empty house. They escorted him to the exact same federal building where his wife had just sold his entire future. Placed in a freezing interrogation room, Darren stubbornly attempted to maintain his silence, foolishly believing that Meredith would legally protect him. Agent Reed quickly dismantled his pathetic loyalty. The seasoned investigator played the pristine audio recording of Meredith aggressively offering to testify against him, vividly detailing her eager willingness to send him to a federal penitentiary for decades just to save herself. Confronted with the undeniable, crystal-clear audio of Meredith's ultimate betrayal, Darren completely shattered. The final fragile illusion of his toxic marriage evaporated into absolute nothingness. Driven by a volatile mixture of profound heartbreak and absolute burning vengeance, Darren immediately turned state's witness against his own wife. He aggressively dismantled her entire fabricated narrative piece by piece. He provided the federal agents with exact timestamps, heavily detailed financial ledgers, and the precise locations where Meredith had hidden her illicit digital assets. To deliver the final lethal blow to her freedom, Darren reached into his pocket and handed Agent Reed Meredith's secret, heavily encrypted burner phone. He provided the federal agents with the exact alphanumeric passcode required to unlock the device, handing them a vast unredacted goldmine of highly illegal text messages, offshore routing numbers, and direct communications with the corrupt notary. He ensured she would never manipulate another human being ever again. By the time Darren finished his devastating confession, Meredith's pathetic plea deal was completely incinerated, and her criminal fate was permanently sealed in stone. Meredith did not wait around the federal building to receive her formal immunity agreement. The sharp predatory instincts that had allowed her to manipulate my son for years suddenly flared with a massive warning sign. She noticed the subtle shift in Agent Reed's posture, the whispered conversations between the agents in the hallway, and the chilling realization that Darren was currently detained in the same building. Knowing her husband possessed the absolute capacity to shatter under pressure, she correctly deduced that her pathetic plea deal was entirely dead. She stormed out of the federal headquarters, her mind racing with pure, unadulterated panic. She drove erratically back to her sprawling suburban home, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of corporate grace. She frantically shoved expensive designer clothing, whatever remaining cash she had hidden in the floorboards, and her infant son's necessities into a single heavy leather duffel bag. She possessed no offshore accounts left to drain, no wealthy father to call for a private jet, and absolutely no husband to hide behind. Her sole objective was to reach the international airport, purchase a one-way cash ticket on the next available flight out of the state, and vanish entirely into the wind before the federal warrants could be officially processed and executed. She strapped her crying child into the back seat of her luxury SUV, completely unaware that the vehicle she was using to flee federal prosecution was legally registered to the very company she had actively attempted to steal. As Meredith aggressively merged onto the bustling interstate highway, the large digital dashboard in my secure home office illuminated with a bright, pulsing tracking indicator. I was calmly sipping a cup of black coffee, watching her frantic high-speed trajectory map out perfectly across the screen. I did not need to hire a private investigator to monitor her desperate escape attempt. Decades ago, long before commercial GPS systems became an industry standard, Gwendolyn and I suffered a massive string of cargo thefts. To protect our vulnerable logistics network, my brilliant wife mandated the covert installation of military-grade tracking nodes deep within the chassis of every single vehicle registered to Iron Route Logistics. The luxury SUV Meredith proudly drove as a symbol of her unearned wealth was legally owned by my corporate fleet, and I possessed the absolute executive authority to monitor its exact location down to the millimeter. I did not attempt to call her or warn her of her impending doom. I picked up my encrypted phone and dialed a direct, secure line to Agent Reed at the Federal Bureau. I coldly provided the lead investigator with her exact coordinates, her current highway speed, and her unmistakable trajectory toward the primary international airport. I informed the federal authorities that an active flight risk was currently operating my corporate property. The federal net immediately tightened. I put on my heavy wool coat, adjusted my tie with absolute precision, and instructed my private driver to bring the town car around. I was not going to miss the final curtain call of her pathetic performance. Meredith arrived in the bustling airport departure terminal with a chaotic, screeching halt. She threw the heavy luxury SUV into park right against the busy commercial curb, entirely ignoring the loud whistles of the irritated traffic enforcement officers. She scrambled wildly out of the driver's seat, desperate to unbuckle her crying child and grab her heavy duffel bag from the trunk before the automated security cameras could flag her license plate. She truly believed she had successfully outrun the massive federal hammer. She was completely wrong. Before her hand could even grasp the zipper of her luggage, 4 dark, heavily armored federal vehicles swarmed the departure lane with brutal, terrifying precision. The massive black SUVs aggressively boxed her vehicle in from all sides, entirely cutting off any possible physical avenue of escape. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents poured out of the vehicles, their tactical vests displaying the stark yellow letters of the FBI. The chaotic noise of the busy airport terminal instantly evaporated into a dead, paralyzed silence as travelers froze in sheer terror. Agent Reed stepped out of the lead vehicle holding a thick stack of finalized federal arrest warrants. He did not yell or draw his weapon. He simply pointed a firm, authoritative finger directly at Meredith. The agents moved with flawless military execution, aggressively pinning Meredith against the side of the corporate SUV. They swiftly secured her wrists in heavy steel handcuffs, ignoring her frantic, hysterical screams of protest. The federal authorities gently, and professionally removed the crying infant from the back seat, immediately placing the child in the protective custody of a waiting social services worker. Meredith thrashed wildly against the cold metal of the vehicle, shrieking that she was a wealthy, innocent victim being violently targeted by corrupt authorities. Her flawless corporate mask was entirely shattered, exposing the feral, terrified criminal hiding underneath. Just as the federal agents finished reading her Miranda rights, my sleek black town car pulled smoothly into the cordoned-off departure lane. I stepped out onto the concrete curb, my tailored suit projecting absolute impenetrable authority. I walked directly past the heavily armed agents holding a single piece of official corporate documentation. I did not look at the screaming woman right away. I calmly handed Agent Reed the notarized asset reclamation form, officially verifying that the luxury SUV was stolen corporate property that I was legally repossessing on behalf of Iron Route Logistics. Meredith spotted me standing on the curb, and whatever remaining shred of human decency she possessed completely evaporated into pure, unadulterated venom. Realizing that I had personally orchestrated her catastrophic downfall and tracked her exact location, she lost her mind entirely. Bound by heavy steel chains, she lunged toward me, spitting vicious, utterly vile racist insults that echoed loudly across the shocked airport terminal. She screamed that I was nothing but a lucky, pathetic old man who did not deserve a single dime of the empire I had built. She unleashed decades of hidden bigotry, proving exactly what kind of monster Gwendolyn had warned me about from the very beginning. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not argue with a caged animal. I stepped forward, reached directly into the pocket of her expensive, ruined coat, and retrieved the keys to my corporate vehicle. I looked her directly in her bloodshot, furious eyes and offered her a slow, brilliant, and completely triumphant smile. I turned my back on her furious screaming, handed the keys to my private driver, and walked back to my town car, leaving her to be shoved into the back of a dark federal transport vehicle forever. Meredith's arraignment was a brutal, highly publicized affair due to the massive scale of the federal wire fraud and her documented status as a severe flight risk. The federal judge aggressively denied her bail. She traded her designer coats for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, locked permanently in a federal detention center awaiting trial. Darren, on the other hand, managed to narrowly escape the cold reality of a prison cell. His eager cooperation with Agent Reed and his willingness to completely eviscerate his wife on the federal record granted him full immunity from criminal prosecution. However, immunity from the law did not mean immunity from the devastating real-world consequences of his boundless greed. He was left entirely destitute. With his trust funds dissolved, his massive corporate salary terminated, and his personal bank accounts completely drained by legal fees and his sudden divorce, Darren had absolutely nothing left. He was evicted from his luxury suburban home and forced to move into a cheap, miserable motel on the outskirts of the city. Furthermore, the sprawling federal indictment was public knowledge. The business community across the state read the detailed reports of how he attempted to steal his own father's logistics empire. His professional reputation was completely incinerated overnight. No respectable company would ever hire a man who actively conspired to commit massive corporate fraud. He was an absolute pariah, stripped of his unearned wealth and wandering through the wreckage of his own catastrophic choices. Despite his complete and total financial ruin, Darren still harbored a profound, staggering level of entitlement. Driven by sheer desperation and a deeply flawed understanding of paternal forgiveness, he convinced himself that his father would simply reset the board. He genuinely assumed that because Meredith was officially incarcerated and the external threat of William Kensington was neutralized, the dark cloud over our family had miraculously lifted. He believed I would view him as a naive victim of his wife's manipulation rather than an active, willing participant in my attempted destruction. 3 days after Meredith's arrest, Darren arrived at the towering glass headquarters of Iron Route Logistics. He did not arrive in a luxury sports car, but walked from the nearest public transit stop wearing a wrinkled suit that had not been properly dry cleaned. Yet he still marched through the heavy revolving doors with a sickeningly familiar swagger. He approached the main reception desk with the absolute confidence of a returning monarch demanding a guest badge and instructing the receptionist to inform my executive suite that the vice president had arrived to resume his duties. He expected to walk straight into the private elevator ride up to the top floor and find me waiting with open arms and a fresh employment contract to save him from his miserable motel room. He severely underestimated the absolute permanence of the boundary I had drawn. I was actively monitoring the lobby through the high-definition security cameras in my office. I did not buzz him up to my suite. I did not offer him the dignity of a private conversation behind closed doors. I picked up a single object from the corner of my office, bypassed the executive elevator, and walked down to the main floor to handle my biological son in full view of the entire corporate staff. The busy corporate lobby fell into an immediate tense silence the exact second I stepped out of the private elevator. Dozens of employees, couriers, and visiting clients stopped in their tracks watching the unfolding confrontation. I walked directly toward the reception desk, carrying a standard cheap brown cardboard box. Inside the box were the absolute last remaining personal items Darren had left in his former executive suite. A framed college diploma, a silver desk clock, and a few useless golf trophies. I did not greet him. I did not offer a handshake. I simply shoved the cardboard box forcefully into his chest, forcing him to grab it or let it crash to the polished marble floor. Darren stumbled backward, gripping the flimsy box, his confident smile instantly shattering into a mask of pure confusion. "Dad, what is this?" he stammered, looking frantically around the quiet lobby as my employees watched his public humiliation. "I came here to get back to work. Meredith is gone now. We do not have to fight anymore. I am ready to step back into my role and help you rebuild the fleet operations." I stared at him with an expression of absolute impenetrable stone. "You do not have a role in this building," I stated, my deep voice projecting clearly across the silent marble lobby. "You do not have an office, you do not have a title, and you do not have a father who will finance your pathetic existence. You willingly conspired to declare me mentally incompetent. You stood by and watched your wife steal from my employees. You brought corrupt lawyers into my home to steal my legacy. I fired you weeks ago, and that termination is absolutely permanent." Darren's face flushed a deep, humiliating shade of red. He clutched the cardboard box tightly, his knuckles turning white as the crushing reality of his situation finally pierced his thick skull. He was not a returning executive. He was an unemployed, broke trespasser begging for a handout in a building he used to own. The sheer weight of my rejection broke whatever remaining pride he possessed. Darren abandoned all pretense of corporate dignity and completely broke down right there in the middle of the crowded lobby. Tears streamed down his face as he desperately tried to leverage the one thing he thought could still manipulate my heart. "Please, Dad," he begged, his voice cracking loudly. "I have absolutely nothing left. I am sleeping in a freezing motel. No one will hire me. You cannot do this to your own blood. Mom would never want this. Gwendolyn would want you to forgive me. She would want us to be a family again." The mention of my beautiful, brilliant wife by the very man who had eagerly helped desecrate her final wishes ignited a cold, lethal fury inside my chest. I took one step forward, forcing Darren to shrink back against the security turnstiles. "Do not ever speak her name again," I commanded, my voice dropping into a dangerous, terrifying register. "Your mother spent her entire life building an empire of integrity, and you tried to hand it to a pack of thieves. She would be utterly disgusted by the coward standing in front of me. You made your bed when you chose to align yourself with parasites. You chose your path. Now walk it alone." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on his weeping, pathetic display and gave a sharp, decisive nod to the two heavily armed security guards stationed near the entrance. The guards immediately stepped forward, grabbing Darren firmly by the arms. They physically marched my biological son through the revolving doors and shoved him out onto the cold concrete sidewalk, permanently exiling him from my empire. I walked back to the executive elevator without a single look backward, finally completely free of the toxic dead weight that had plagued my life. The physical removal of Darren from the headquarters was a necessary and deeply satisfying amputation, but the residual infection of his incompetence still lingered in the corporate atmosphere. The massive federal raid, the scandalous public arrest of Meredith at the airport, and the temporary operational freeze had successfully caught the attention of the national industry press. The logistics sector is a notoriously cutthroat environment where weakness is instantly penalized. Scenting blood in the water, my primary competitors immediately began circling my vulnerable empire like starving vultures. Aggressive rival firms launched predatory marketing campaigns directed specifically at my highest-paying corporate clients. They sent slick sales representatives to whisper poisonous doubts into the ears of supply chain managers, suggesting that Iron Route Logistics was crumbling under a catastrophic family civil war. They heavily emphasized the recent fuel delays and the federal investigations actively pitching themselves as the stable, secure alternative to my supposedly collapsing network. The sheer volume of incoming calls from anxious regional directors and nervous shipping partners threatened to overwhelm my dispatch centers. My executive dashboard lit up with urgent contract renegotiation requests from 3 of our largest national accounts. They were actively preparing to jump ship, terrified that the negative media coverage would directly impact their own quarterly freight deliverables. I had successfully defended my castle from thieves within my own walls, but now I had to defend the outer gates from opportunistic mercenaries trying to steal my gold while the smoke was still clearing. I did not retreat to my own executive suite to manage the escalating public relations disaster. Instead, I walked down the hall and unlocked the heavy mahogany door to Gwendolyn's old office, a room that had remained impeccably preserved since the day she retired. I sat behind her massive vintage desk, running my hands over the smooth, polished wood where she had brokered some of the most complex freight deals in the history of the Eastern Seaboard. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet stillness of her sanctuary wash over my tense shoulders. I desperately needed her sharp, unsentimental clarity. My mind drifted back to the brutal recession of 1992 when a malicious rumor spread that our company was filing for bankruptcy. Our competitors had manufactured the lie to trigger a panic among our creditors. Instead of hiding behind expensive public relations firms or issuing vague corporate press releases, Gwendolyn had executed a masterclass in crisis management. She always told me that shadows breed monsters and absolute transparency is the only weapon that instantly kills a rumor. If you let other people tell your story, she had said, her voice echoing perfectly in my memory, they will write you as the tragic victim. You must control the narrative by exposing the ugly truth yourself and showing them that you are the one holding the axe. I opened my eyes, the strategic path forward completely illuminated. I was not going to hide behind my legal team or issue cowardly apologies for the disruption. I was going to leverage the brutal, unvarnished truth to prove that the recent chaos was not a sign of corporate weakness, but a violent, necessary cleansing. I instructed my executive assistant to bypass all lower-level supply chain managers and patch me directly through to the private cell phones of the chief executive officers of our 10 largest national clients. I did not delegate this task to my sales department. I initiated the calls myself, speaking with the absolute gravelly authority of a man who had completely sterilized his own empire. When the first CEO answered with a cautious, hesitant tone, expecting a desperate plea for patience, I immediately took control of the conversation. I did not sugarcoat the recent federal raids or the brief operational lockouts. I explicitly detailed the hostile takeover attempt orchestrated by my own daughter-in-law and the spectacular federal failure of her criminal enterprise. I plainly stated that I had personally initiated the purge of my own toxic family members from the executive board to protect the integrity of the freight network. I informed them that the weak, corrupt management layer had been completely eradicated, and that I was personally resuming total daily command of the national dispatch grids. The brutal honesty caught them entirely off guard. In a corporate world dominated by spin doctors and polished lies, hearing a founder admit that he had just handed his own family over to the FBI to protect his client contracts was a staggering display of ruthless accountability. I guaranteed them flawless future operations backed by my personal 40-year reputation in the dirt and oil of the trucking industry. The response was universally positive. The CEOs respected the fierce, uncompromising integrity it took to amputate a corrupted limb. They realized that a logistics partner willing to destroy his own bloodline to safeguard a delivery schedule was the most reliable partner they could ever retain. By the end of the afternoon, not a single major contract was canceled. In fact, 3 of the executives were so impressed by my absolute transparency that they actively expanded our service agreements, signing massive multi-year renewals right over the phone. As the sun began to set behind the sprawling industrial skyline, casting a warm golden glow through the large windows of Gwendolyn's office, the heavy door clicked open. Jonathan walked in carrying a sleek black leather folder. The exhaustion of the past few weeks was visible around his eyes, but his posture remained impeccably sharp. He approached the vintage desk and placed the folder carefully on the center blotter. He did not say a word at first, allowing the profound weight of the moment to settle between us. We had fought a grueling multi-front corporate war, and we had emerged with the castle completely intact. Jonathan opened the folder, revealing the final, highly anticipated legal documents. "Lawrence," he said, his voice quiet but filled with deep professional satisfaction. "These are the finalized, irrevocable execution orders. They formally dissolve Darren's remaining generational trust funds, liquidate his residual stock options, and permanently sever his legal status as an heir to the Iron Root Logistics estate. Signing these pages will officially conclude the corporate purge." I looked down at the pristine white paper, the final administrative nail in the coffin of my son's unearned privilege. There was no hesitation left in my heart, no lingering doubt about the severe punishment I was administering. Darren had actively chosen to be a predator, and he had met a predator's fate. I reached across Gwendolyn's desk and picked up her heavy, gold-plated fountain pen, the exact same pen she had used to sign our very first trucking contract 4 decades ago. I felt the comforting, familiar weight of the metal resting perfectly between my fingers. I was no longer preserving an old empire for an ungrateful child. I was ready to completely rewrite my legacy on my own exact terms. I pressed the golden nib of Gwendolyn's fountain pen against the heavy parchment, signing my name with absolute, uncompromising finality. The wet ink officially erased my biological son from my legacy forever. Jonathan collected the documents, gave a brief nod of profound respect, and quietly exited the office. 6 months later, the justice system delivered its ultimate, crushing conclusion. I sat at my desk reading the official federal sentencing report Jonathan had forwarded to my secure terminal. Meredith's arrogant gamble had officially ended behind heavy steel doors. The federal judge, entirely unswayed by her desperate theatrical tears during the sentencing hearing, handed her exactly 8 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. She traded her designer dresses and expensive jewelry for an oversized, scratchy orange jumpsuit and the brutal reality of an 8x10 concrete cell. Her wealthy father never even attended the trial, completely abandoning her to the wolves to shield his own remaining assets. Darren experienced a much different but equally devastating flavor of absolute ruin. Stripped of his executive title, his massive trust fund, and his unearned pride, my former son was forced to flee the state to escape his profound public disgrace. Private investigators confirmed he was currently residing in a cramped, miserable studio apartment 2,000 miles away. He spent his days working grueling, back-breaking shifts in a sweltering fulfillment warehouse for minimum wage. He was finally experiencing the exhausting, merciless reality of physical labor he had spent his entire life desperately avoiding. I closed the federal report and shifted my attention to the glowing financial dashboard illuminating my executive suite. The numbers staring back at me were not just stable, they were absolutely staggering. Iron Root Logistics had not merely survived the vicious corporate siege. Stripping away the bloated, toxic management layer had drastically streamlined our entire operational grid. Without Darren siphoning funds for his illicit kickbacks and luxury expenses, our profit margins surged to unprecedented heights. I was looking at the most lucrative, record-breaking quarter in the 40-year history of the company. The massive influx of capital required a permanent, bulletproof destination. I picked up my phone and authorized Jonathan to execute the final phase of my master plan. I legally transferred the vast majority of my personal corporate shares and liquid fortune into a newly formed, heavily guarded philanthropic trust. I named it the Gwendolyn Foundation. We did not build our empire just to hoard wealth or fund the delusions of an entitled, ungrateful child. Gwendolyn and I built this company to break barriers. The foundation was specifically designed with aggressive, uncompromising bylaws. It redirected our massive logistics fortune to fully fund high-tier business scholarships, aggressive seed capital, and direct mentorship programs for underprivileged minority entrepreneurs. I ensured that the money my son had tried to steal would instead be used to build a massive army of brilliant, hungry young men and women who understood the true, brutal value of hard work. Gwendolyn's name would forever be associated with building generational power, permanently erasing the pathetic stain of Meredith and Darren's greed. The following Sunday morning arrived with a crisp, brilliant blue sky and a gentle, comforting breeze. I drove my dark sedan to the quiet, rolling hills of the cemetery, walking the familiar stone path until I reached the beautiful marble headstone marking my wife's final resting place. The grass had grown thick and vibrant around the site, a sharp contrast to the cold, muddy dirt I had stared at during the funeral 6 months ago. I knelt down slowly, brushing a few fallen autumn leaves away from the engraved letters of her name. I placed a massive, vibrant bouquet of fresh white lilies directly against the marble, perfectly arranging the pristine petals just the way she always loved them on our kitchen table. I did not feel the crushing, paralyzing weight of grief that had almost suffocated me on the day we buried her. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute clarity. "We did it, my beautiful Gwendolyn," I said, my deep voice carrying softly across the quiet, peaceful cemetery grounds. The parasites have been completely burned away. I told her about the record-breaking profits, the fierce loyalty of the dispatchers, and the massive new contracts we had secured. I told her about the foundation bearing her name, and the brilliant young minds it was already beginning to elevate. I spoke to her with the unwavering certainty of a man who had successfully defended a fortress against a brutal siege. "You warned me about the wolves hiding in our own home, and you left me the exact weapons I needed to slaughter them," I whispered, resting my hand flat against the cold, solid marble. "Our life's work is finally safe. The Empire is completely untouchable. Nobody will ever weaponize our blood and sweat again." I stayed by her side for nearly an hour, simply enjoying the serene, unbroken tranquility, completely secure in the knowledge that I had fiercely honored every single promise I had ever made to her. I drove back to my sprawling suburban estate as the late afternoon sun began casting long, golden shadows across the meticulously manicured lawn. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside the highly encrypted security system, chiming softly to welcome me back. The house was completely empty, but it no longer felt like a dark, isolated tomb. It felt like a pristine, impenetrable sanctuary. I walked over to the vintage wooden bar in my private study and reached for my heaviest crystal glass. I poured a generous measure of premium-aged bourbon, the rich amber liquid glowing warmly in the fading sunlight. I walked over to my favorite leather armchair and sat down heavily, letting the deep, comfortable cushions absorb the physical exhaustion of the past 6 months. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon, feeling the familiar, pleasant burn travel down my chest. I looked out the large bay windows, watching the gentle wind rustle through the towering oak trees surrounding my secure property. There were no corrupt lawyers pounding on my door. There were no entitled children demanding unearned fortunes. There were no manipulative daughters-in-law plotting hostile takeovers in the shadows. There was absolutely nothing but the quiet, steady rhythm of my own breathing. For months, the silence in this house had felt like a heavy, suffocating weapon used against me by people who wanted me to feel utterly alone. But as I sat there savoring my drink and gazing out over my quiet, reclaimed kingdom, the silence transformed. It was no longer a weapon. It was the beautiful, undeniable sound of absolute victory and permanent peace. True wealth is not merely the accumulation of capital, real estate, or corporate titles. It is the unbreakable resilience forged in the hot, unforgiving furnace of building it. This powerful story teaches us the lethal danger of unearned entitlement within families. Darren and Meredith genuinely believed that manipulating legal documents and freezing bank accounts made them powerful. They confused the superficial trappings of authority with actual strength. However, inherited privilege creates a devastating blind spot. It teaches people how to spend vast fortunes, but it never teaches them how to survive when the system inevitably collapses. Lawrence and Gwendolyn built their empire from the asphalt up. They survived systemic racism, union strikes, and predatory lending because they deeply understood the brutal mechanics of survival. When Meredith and Darren launched their hostile takeover, they foolishly assumed they were simply attacking a fragile, grieving old man. In reality, they were blindly stepping into an absolute masterclass, expertly taught by a tested veteran of corporate warfare. The profound lesson here is that you must never surrender your leverage to those individuals who have not truly earned their scars. You should love your family, but carefully verify their loyalty through their actions, not their titles. Gwendolyn's brilliance lay in her extreme paranoia. She built hidden tripwires and fail-safes because she knew that unearned wealth often breeds ravenous, unchecked entitlement. You must proactively protect your legacy by building your own poison pills. Establish firm boundaries that remain absolutely non-negotiable. Realize that true power primarily resides in the ability to walk away, to permanently cut the cord, and to let toxic individuals drown in the devastating consequences of their own malicious decisions. Do not ever let foolish sentimentality blind you to the cold, harsh truth of human nature. If someone views your lifetime of grueling sacrifice as merely a convenient stepping stone for their own greed, you owe them absolutely nothing. You have the right to protect your peace, your assets, and your dignity at all costs. Did this story resonate with you? Have you ever had to draw an absolute unforgiving line to protect your own legacy from extremely toxic people? Share your experiences in the comments below right now. Hit the like button, subscribe to our growing channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss more engaging stories about surviving deep family betrayal and successfully taking back your ultimate power today.